Well, hello, State Representative Dave Pinto here, and I want to welcome you to what is now the third anniversary of the first beginning of the fourth year of the PreNatal 3 Policy Forums. Okay. So the first one was held in June of 2016, so I guess we're just a little bit beyond the 3-year mark. And a reminder, if you look in the back of your agendas, at least I think that they're printed on the backs, yes they are, of the purpose. So the policy forums were co-founded by the Elders for Infants and by me, and the purposes are threefold. There's three purposes: to share plans among the different advocates working in this space, to build a base of knowledge. The test that we've been asking ourselves is what would be irresponsible for someone advocating in this space to not know, and then try to use these forums to fill that gap. And the third thing is to build the relationships among the folks advocating in this area. And so as we say, the networking time is actually the most important part of any particular forum rather than whatever we program in terms of content. So those 3 points. And excited today to be looking back at the legislative session that just completed and saying what can we be doing moving forward together. And I'll be presenting a little bit more on that. You'll be hearing from Senator Ralph and others as well. So we're so glad to have you here, especially at this little bit earlier start time. And so about maybe a little bit more than a year into the policy forums, we were joined, and I should know too, by the way, so grateful to Dr. Carvalho, to Corinne, and to the School of Social Work for having hosted us. I think it was maybe at the second forum, and then ever since, which has been wonderful, and a partnership with the school and the amazing work that they do. And then we were joined by a fourth partner, maybe about a year or so in, Senator Jerry Ralph, and so glad to have his involvement as well. So if you'll please join me in welcoming Senator Jerry Ralph. And he's coming up.
A little slow this morning. Yeah, just welcome. It's great to see this many people here on a warm summer day. I was just saying, somebody asked me, how's my summer going? And I said, what summer? So thank you all for coming out. David, as Dave mentioned, we'll be talking a little more detail. This forum has been a wonderful opportunity for me as a freshman senator coming in to gain information and insight from people from all sides, all walks, and all persuasions. And so I want to thank everybody here for the input and the help that you've provided me over the last 3 years to try and be able to become more familiar. When I was put on the Human Services Committee in the Senate, I said, what? I thought a waiver was something you signed so you didn't have to do something. So it's been a long curve, and I'm still learning, and appreciate the input that I've received from you. So as we go forward, welcome, and thank you for being here.
Well, it's great to see everyone. Welcome. As Dave was saying, this is kind of an anniversary of sorts. I should move it forward. There, okay. And this has been a dozen. Now we're going to be starting a new round in the fall. I'll say October 21st. We have a reservation here. Whether we start at 8:30 or 9 will be debated, because 8:30 is early, and we appreciate your being here. So we have a full agenda this morning, and what I want to just kind of call out is that there will be a number of people presenting. You've heard already a little bit from Senator Ralph. If he's still here, we will call you up for Q&A also. So the next round of people who speak will also be available then for the questions and answers. So without taking any more time, I want to invite up Laura LaCroix DeLune from the PreNatal toThree Coalition. And you'll see, for people in the studio, as I call you, the studio audience, the webinar audience, we want you to be able to know that there is a name for everyone who's speaking. And then down at the bottom is a website or a message place for sending your email questions. So, and we'll have that up during the Q&A. So here's Laura. Oh, sure. So everyone come on down.
Is that too? Yeah. Do you want us? Can we just bring chairs?
Yeah, bring chairs.
Okay. So our party, we're gonna we're gonna play a game. If I called you and asked you to help on this section, grab a chair up here and come up front. No, that's okay. I just think it'll be easier if we're up here because we have a whole number of people. And good morning. I'm Laura LaCroix DeLune, and I have the great honor of being the project coordinator for Minnesota's PreNatal toThree Coalition. For those of you who are not familiar with the coalition, we began in 2018 with the idea of trying to help bring together the voices who are supporting children and families at this critical time, a lot of it being based on our conversations that have happened here through the forums, but really working to coordinate our policy and advocacy agenda as well. Currently, Nancy Jost with the West Central Initiative and Barty Wahi with Children's Defense Fund Minnesota are the co-chairs of the coalition. And our vision is really about when we focus on addressing the racial, economic, and geographic inequities for children and families, that we know all families will thrive in Minnesota. So we really are trying to address the inequities in our policies and in our funding sources for families so that all families can thrive. And then we have two primary goals, and we focus on raising awareness about the importance of supporting children and families during this important time and on increasing investments. And so the coalition does not do this work alone. We actually have engaged many different advocacy organizations, and so today you'll hear from a number of different people on how we work together. They will quickly identify what it is that they were striving to do, where we were successful, what passed, what didn't pass, and even some of the issues that came up, that kind of the challenges that got in the way of us being successful. But before we start, we thought it would be really helpful to set a little bit of context for this 2019 legislative session. And just wanted to, for those of you who maybe aren't as into the day-and-day operations at the legislative session or at the legislature, there are things that impact the way in which we do our work and try to work on behalf of children and families. So as you all know, we have a new governor. So we had a big transition happening in the administration. So we have a new governor, lieutenant governor, all new administration, which also means all the agency commissioners were new. I think all but one changed, two commissioners stayed on with us. We had a number of new representatives, House representatives. We have 33 new House members. We had a new speaker, a new majority leader in the House, and we had 2 new senators after the special election. So we had a lot of change. We were the only body, the only state in the country that has a divided government, where we have our House that is led with the Democrats and the Senate, which is led by the Republicans. So that is significant as well. And then we had a whole number of new committee structures, not only in the House where you had all new leadership, and you had a whole number of new committee chairs in the House because of that, but we had a new structure in which advocates were to work and move their policies and agendas through. And then similarly, the Senate added some new committees. So in the House, Representative Pinto, of course, was the chair of the Early Childhood Finance and Policy Committee, which was a new committee aimed at trying to hear as many of the early childhood policies as possible. And then they moved their work up through the Health and Human Services Committee and through the Education Committee. And in the Senate, they added the Family Care and Aging Committee, and there were a number of family child care issues that came through that committee that then had to get routed through 1 or 2 other human services committees, depending on how it moved through the Senate. So all of that is to lay context that there was a lot of new things happening, and it really did, I think, impact the way in which all of us did our work on behalf of children and families. So you'll see that there's some wins, and then there's some losses that we were a little surprised by ourselves. So I just wanted to lay that big picture context, and then Kelly is going to come up, Kelly Wolf with Children's Minnesota. She will come up and then help set up some more of the big picture budget. I'm going to play, I'm going to stay up here and just call people up as we go then. Okay?
Great, thank
Kelly,
you.
thank you.
And then is this my clicker? Yes, perfect. Great, wonderful. Good morning. Thank you for that setup because that was super helpful. I think what I'll do is just kind of give you a little bit more context into kind of how the legislative process happened, what the final budget agreement was, and what that meant for the Health and Human Services budget in particular. Some of the issues that I'll talk about aren't necessarily ones that the P3 coalition was working on behalf of our earliest and youngest children, but really I think it's important just to know in the broader context of how we're taking care of children and families as a whole, because we all know that all of these issues are related. So to start with, I will say that the legislative session kicked off. It was busy. Committees met for several or 3 or 4 months, doing conference committees and hearing bills, and trying to put together budgets, but couldn't really do so without an agreed upon budget, which was really the sticking point. And so what ended up happening was on May 20th, the date of adjournment, the legislature adjourned without a final budget agreement in place, which really meant that all of these issues and the bills that had been heard along the way ultimately couldn't get passed because we didn't know how much money, the committees didn't know how much money that they could spend. So the legislature adjourned on Monday, May 20th, and then the governor and legislative leaders worked over those next few days to really kind of negotiate some of these big sticking points that were kind of preventing them from getting a budget done. One was a formula increase for K-12 that was agreed upon by the leaders to do a 2% per pupil formula increase for the K-12 budget. The other issue that was a sticking point was a gas tax. Governor Walz came into the legislative session really wanting a 20-cent gas tax to help fund transportation initiatives. Senate Republicans weren't interested in a gas tax, and ultimately at the end of the day there was no gas tax increase. The other thing that was a major sticking point that I'll get into in a little more detail was something called the provider tax, which really was a linchpin and really was kind of the biggest elephant in the room during the legislative session, because without knowing what to do on a provider tax and having a revenue stream for the Health and Human Services budget, nothing could really get done. So in addition to those agreed upon things, the education budget also included $540 million. That did include that formula increase, that 2% formula increase. There was additional dollars for school safety funding, special education funding, and a continuation of voluntary pre-K slots, which was about $46 million. I also want to highlight that in addition to those great things being included in the education budget, a program called Reach Out and Read was also included. Thanks to the leadership of Dr. Chamalo. That was a big win. For those of you that don't know what Reach Out and Read is, this is a program that healthcare providers utilize in their clinics. They hand out books at every well child checkup to the kids, and they use those books as an opportunity to talk about the importance of early literacy and engagement and kind of the serve and return that we know is so important and critical for early brain development. So it's a really wonderful program, and the money that was passed in the education budget is a small step to allowing us to really expand that program statewide. So thank you for that. That was a win that we were really proud to see. The other interesting thing I will note that is, even though the provider tax was ultimately decided on, there were still cuts to the Health and Human Services budget. Well, I should say reduced spending for the next biennium to about $358 million. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in detail. So the provider tax, for those of you that don't know, the provider tax was something that was implemented in the state legislature in 1998. It was a 2% tax on healthcare providers. The reason that they did that is because they recognized that they needed a dedicated fund or pool of money to make sure that we could provide health care coverage and access to health care for Minnesotans. It's what helps fund our Medicaid program. It's what helps fund our Minnesota Care program, and it's really instrumental. It's about $800 to $900 million that the legislature uses and the state uses to fund those health care programs. In 2011, that provider tax was sunset, and that was largely, I think, a decision and some perspectives that the state really should try and consolidate all of these separate buckets of money, and we should really be funding health care services out of the general fund budget so that we know what we're spending money on. But I think the loss of the $800 to $900 million, or the potential loss of that, was really concerning. We want to make sure that we have a safety net and that we're able to provide health care coverage for all Minnesotans. So that was a major priority of House Democrats and the governor, was to reinstate that provider tax so that that money and that additional funding would not go away. That was kind of the elephant in the room the whole legislative session. Again, without knowing what that $800 to $900 million, whether or not that was there, I think it really kind of hamstrung the people making decisions because they just didn't know what money that they had to work with. So during the negotiations, after the special session, between the special session, they did agree to reduce the rate of the provider tax to 1.8% instead of the 2% and extend it into the future, which was a huge win for advocates. It still brings over $800 million of revenue to the Healthcare Access Fund. And again, this is what funds our healthcare system. So this was a massive win for healthcare providers, and I think a big win for a lot of people. The other just really quick things I want to highlight in the healthcare budget that was included, because even though there was a reduction in spending, there were really some great targeted investments made for children, particularly around children's mental health. I think we all know that there's a huge mental health crisis happening with our children. So they did a couple things. Schooling mental health services were continued to be funded. This is a way for schools to utilize or to draw down Medicaid dollars so that they can continue to provide mental health services in schools. So DHS does now have the authority to expand that over the next few years. They also funded suicide prevention, and that included funding for mobile mental health crisis units as well as a suicide hotline. And then they also authorized an additional 150 pediatric psychiatric residential beds, which will really help for the kids that need intensive psychiatric services. Right now, we just don't have a system and an infrastructure to support those kiddos and put them in the places that they need to be. So that will go a long way for that. Sorry.
That's okay.
The only last thing I will say, because I just think this is important, I know, is that Minnesota was the first state in the country to put a tax on the manufacturers of opioids. And I say this because I think this is an important issue for children and for families. Even though we think that opioid abusers tend to be adults, when we think about the stresses that that has put on our county and social service agencies and what that's done to the kids in the system, I think this will go a long way. It puts a tax on the manufacturers of opioids, which then creates a fund of $20 million that will be used to help offset the costs associated with county social services, and then use that additional fund for training, education, and awareness and prevention on opioids. So even though there was a reduction in health and human services in spending, I think some really great targeted things were able to be done for kids. So thank you. Happy to answer questions later. Thanks.
Thank you. All right, thank you. Clearly, I'm going to be the one to introduce people and push them off when they're taking too much time. It's good information, though, so I want to share it, and I'll push lightly. Okay, so what I wanted to just do, in addition to setting that context, so thank you, Kelly, for helping me set the context, is just do a really quick reminder. These are the key priority policy issues that we, as collectively, through the coalition of coalitions, really work toward. So prenatal care for high-risk pregnancies, really trying to pay attention to inequities in maternal death rates and infant mortality rates, home visiting services, paid family and medical leave, paying attention to our child care crisis in a number of different ways. You'll hear from a few different people about that. Really paying attention to the workforce, the dynamics that are going on, the interplays. There's lots of policy solutions for addressing the incredibly low pay that are pushing people out of this profession, and then the community-led solutions specifically through the Community Solutions Fund. So I'm going to call up my colleagues who are content experts and policy experts in this area, and I'm going to start with T. McClenty, and if you want to come up and talk with us a little bit about the work you did with the integrated care for high-risk pregnancies.
Well, two things she said was experts, and then she said she was going to push us off the stage if we take too long. She won't have that problem with me, but my name is T. McClenty, and I work at North Point. So integrated care for high-risk pregnancies began as a pilot to address inequities in maternal health outcomes during pregnancy and birth and infant mortality rates for African-born African-American women and Native American women. There is base funding for this work in the Department of Human Services. Language was included in the Health and Human Service Finance Bill to eliminate the sunset date and keep the program operating. Language was included to increase the Medicaid reimbursement rates for doulas during birth and visits for pre and post birth. Medicaid reimbursement rates for doulas increased to $47 for each pre-postnatal visit, and is $488 for delivery and birthing experience. The total budget for fiscal year 2021 is $64,000 and increases to $105,000 in fiscal year 22-23. The integrative care model has on the Hennepin County side, North Point Health and Wellness Center, and then on the Ramsey County side is Open Cities and Metro Cities Open Cities. So North Point is called, we have a group called AYA, and then on the St. Paul side for Open Cities, they are called Nubian Moms, and then for Metro Cities, they are called Diva Moms. All of us do integrated care model to work with high-risk pregnant African-American women. A lot of us receive referrals. At North Point, we receive referrals from 47 different organizations or providers, and then we do an integrated model to provide care to pregnant women or women who are 6 months postpartum.
Great, thank you. You were fast. Okay, I do not see Atande Awa. Did I miss her? Okay, so I'm going to cover for the Targeted Home Visiting Coalition, since Atande is not here, as previously scheduled. So the Home Visiting Coalition, the Targeted Home Visiting Coalition, was successful back in 2017 in getting resources, state resources for home visiting services, for evidence-based home visiting services. And I want to say that this is a really narrow definition of quality home visiting services. And you've heard me over time, and you've heard Atande over time, and our members and stakeholders, that the evidence-based programs we're talking about are those that are approved by HRSA, which has a really, really high bar on quality. There are a number of other national home visiting models that maybe didn't meet that criteria that we are also know that have been successful, and or other evidence-informed programs that have been very successful. So the Home Visiting Coalition, not only did we work to secure and work with the PreNatal toThree Coalition to secure that additional $21 million that was in the base and that did pass, which is wonderful to see those resources being available to families. We were not successful in getting the policy and adding some flexibility. And so therefore, we still have work to do and increasing the flexibility and the types of programs that are available to families. So we've been working closely with the Department of Health, and we also know that there are model programs being run through the Department of Education, so Head Start and Early Head Start. We have a number of focused programs, education-focused programs that also would be eligible, we think, in the future if we broaden that umbrella, and then also through the Department of Human Services. I do want to, part of what we're trying to do is raise some of the concerns that we saw this session that kind of got in the way of us being successful. The Home Visiting Coalition was quite surprised to see all the concerns pop back up about privacy, data privacy as it relates to home visiting. So these were some concerns that came up a few years ago, 2, 3, 4 years ago. We had worked with legislators to help them understand this. We had worked to prove that there are all these safeguards in place. And many times, During hearings, people would push back on data privacy, and when I would go to legislators afterwards and say, is there any evidence, and are you pushing back on your own constituents? Are they showing you evidence of these concerns? No one could show any concerns. So part of what we were faced with is this what if, this is a possible, and not enough of us standing up and telling people not to be concerned, right? So we have, not only as advocates are we there to advocate for the resources, but to also help our other constituents and citizens understand what's really going on. And I think we need to do a better job in that going forward. And then the other piece that kept cropping up this year, again, we had worked with a number of people in the past, this nanny state idea. Like the state is coming in and gonna take over your parenting, when 100% of this work is voluntary, and yet we're still trying to limit people's access to voluntary services. So, okay, so that's where we were with the home visiting. We also want to bring up Eric. Eric is going to talk through a number of different slides, and he's going to start with the paid family and medical leave, representing their coalition.
Morning. Morning, everyone. My name is Eric Armakonki. I'm with the Children's Defense Fund, and like Laura said, I'll be up here for a few slides, so get comfortable, I guess. So starting off with paid family and medical leave, it was not successful in terms of passage of the legislation. However, the coalition believes we were incredibly successful in terms of raising the profile of the issue and the importance of paid family and medical leave for Minnesotans. I think we set a record this session with 10 committee hearings, which in actuality ended up being a positive aspect because we were able to lay out in every single committee hearing the benefits for children and families, for workers, for businesses. We had a lot of small business support, actually, and then also cost savings for the state, because the way we set up our bill, it's a very family-friendly bill, and it can touch everything from the early stages of life to aging in grace. And we know that so much of our health and human services costs come from things like elder care and child care. And so there's really a lot of great cost-saving potential in terms of paid family and medical leave for a 0.6% premium. So one thing our coalition is really going to be putting forth from here on out is, can you show us an alternative that covers every other, that covers every Minnesotan in the state at such a low cost? And we're excited about being able to put forth that legislation in 2020 and until we get a chance to actually get it done. In terms of challenges, this session, it was really just a challenge of divided government. And although we had a lot of good conversations with folks in the Senate, unfortunately, just the realities of divided government prohibited us from getting it over the finish line this year. But like I said, we're looking forward to coming back until we pass this bill that's so popular across every area of our state. Oh, is the arrow here? All right, so MFIP. MFIP is, for this session, a great point of success. Thank you for Senator Ralph in the crowd for chairing or for authoring the bill in the Senate. It had been 33 years since we had seen an MFIP cash grant increase, which is really a shame. If you think about it, the most folks that are on or that are accessing MFIP are children, and so we've gone 33 years without providing added assistance for some of our children who are most in need. They funded it through a variety of different TANF funding streams, and overall that funding, I believe off the top of my head, is around $40 million in 2021, and then it jumps up to about $60 million in 22, 23. And in addition to Senator Ralph, a really big shout out to Legal Aid and Jess Webster, who are really instrumental in helping us pass this bill. And then last but not least, childcare. So I can kind of boil down childcare to the good, the bad, and the ugly this session. Starting with the good, it had taken us about 6 or 7 years to pass any form of federal conformity. We finally got a bulk of that taken care of, particularly our family-friendly conformity pieces, so provisions to improve childcare for families experiencing homelessness, highly mobile families that might be moving from county to county, and also helping with some faster MFIP transition. So that was the good. Then getting to the bad, it was yet another year of no increased investments in childcare assistance. So no adding funding to buy down the basic sliding fee wait list. Right now, that's around 1,800 families, which just means that's 1,800 families that can't get to work because they can't afford or access childcare. And I don't think anyone in our state really wants that. There's also no movement on provider reimbursement rates. And this is actually to the point of crisis and major concern. It is a federal conformity piece. We were just notified very recently post-session that the federal government will no longer be lenient with us, and we have to increase our provider reimbursement rates. Otherwise, we will get penalized, and we will lose millions and millions of dollars of federal funding. And so we can't underscore this enough. Right now, we're at 2011 rates at the 2015 percentile. The federal government is not going to accept that anymore. And so this upcoming session, that is, if I'm looking ahead a little bit for the Kids Can't Wait Coalition, will be a major piece because, like I said, I don't think anyone wants to lose federal funding, and we've used our last waivers on this. And then now getting into the ugly, the narrative around childcare got very toxic, and it got racialized, and it was incredibly uncomfortable to kind of see the conversations around childcare and how that turned out, around who are providing childcare and who is accessing childcare, and it really just made it impossible to move the issue forward, and we were unable to talk about how critical childcare is for our economy. And with that incredibly toxic narrative, that prevented us from getting movement on the wait list on provider reimbursement rates. And so that is something that I hope as a state advocacy community we can kind of really look and analyze how it got so toxic and how it got so racialized, and hoping we can turn the page on that, and just realizing that all we're really doing is trying to provide childcare for children and for parents that need to go to work. So that's how we finish up on childcare. So happy to answer any questions on childcare, MFIP, or paid family leave at the end. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, perfect. Yes. Save your questions. Write them down if you're going to forget, if you're like me. So thank you, Eric. Okay, let's see. Denise, you are up next. If you...
All right. Well, good morning on this steamy morning. My name's Denise Mayad. I'm the Executive Director for the Sheltering Arms Foundation and a member of the Mini Minds Executive Committee. As I think a lot of you know, Mini Minds is a coalition of more than 100 organizations across the state focused on ensuring that all children are prepared to succeed in school and life. And of course, many members of the coalition are here in the room. We really appreciate the support and energy from our coalition members and partners, including the PreNatal toThree Coalition. We've been a strong advocate for early learning scholarships, and this year it was very exciting because there was support in both the House and the Senate this session, and of course a shout out to Representative Pinto and to Senator Carla Nelson in the Senate for helping to move that forward. As I think a lot of you know, early learning scholarships meet the unique needs of children and families because they're used in high-quality programs rated by Parent Aware. They follow the child until they enter kindergarten, and they give parents the agency to choose programs that best meet their child's specific needs. But unfortunately, final negotiations leading into the special session did not allocate new base budget dollars for scholarships this year. However, it's important to note that existing funds of $70 million per year for early learning scholarships remain intact. And these funds benefit approximately 15,000 young children annually. And additionally, the legislature created a special revenue fund that allows for greater flexibility in administering scholarships from year to year, advancing any unused funds from the year prior. This is really meaningful because with an estimated $4.5 million of unused scholarship money that can now be used for distribution in 2020, it'll allow an additional 600 plus children to receive early learning scholarships to access high-quality programs. So that really does make a difference, and we were grateful that happened. Funding is also going to continue for Parent Aware, Minnesota's quality rating and improvement system used to support early learning demonstration of school readiness best practices. Although there's strong bipartisan support at the Capitol for early childhood, we need to continue to advance ongoing investments in children birth to 3, a time when brain development is critical, as again, I know you all know. With more than 33,000 children that still lack access to quality childcare and education, we have to continue to increase funding to meet the unmet needs of our state's most vulnerable children and families. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Yeah. All right, Krista Anders, you are up with the B8 workgroup.
Good morning, I'm Krista Anders, and I help coordinate the statewide conversations about transforming the early childhood workforce. There were a couple things this legislative session that are relevant to the workforce. The 6 Minnesota Initiative Foundations, which are located in greater Minnesota, where we know the child care crisis is particularly acute, got $750,000 to share between them to increase the supply of quality child care, engage the private sector, do some locally based training and technical assistance, and recruit programs to participate in Parent Aware. So that's good news. The Department of Employment and Economic Development also received $750,000 to increase the supply of quality childcare and support economic development. It's really important that we see the childcare crisis isn't just a human services need, that this is an economic development thing. So having the money go through the Department of Economic or through DEED really highlights how critical childcare is to our state's economy. The YWCA of Minneapolis got $250,000 to continue their Child Development Associate or CDA credential. This is the first credential in a pipeline to higher education and hopefully higher earnings. And there were some amendments to the Minnesota Indian Teacher Education Training Program to include early childhood. We were disappointed that the Grow Your Own legislation that was sponsored by TOCI, the Coalition to Increase Teachers of Colors and American Indian, which included some language where Head Start teachers would have been included in Grow Your Own, was not passed. In 2017, the legislature created the Workforce Development Scholarships, and at the time they created it, they had 4 high-demand occupations, and this session, we were super happy that they added 2 additional high-demand occupations, and one of them was early childhood scholarships. So now, if you're pursuing a degree in early childhood at one of the 30 state colleges and universities, you are eligible to apply for these scholarships. You need to be working, enrolled in at least 9 credits. The scholarships are for $2,500 a year and up to $7,500 over time. So it looks like a lot of money. It actually works out to 25 scholarships per institution. So what I want is about 20 of those scholarships to go to early childhood, and then the other high demand occupations can have the rest. So we need to get early childhood people to apply to those scholarships. So if you know of people who are pursuing education, please refer them there. We were disappointed that there was not additional money for Retain. And again, our challenge is to make sure that people know about those workforce scholarships. So there's information on our website, there's information on the MnSCU site.
Okay, now Claire is going to come on up and talk about MCCA's proposal here on childcare.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Claire Sanford with the Minnesota Child Care Association. Tomorrow's a big day. It's the 50th anniversary of the moon landing, which is a big deal for me because I've wanted to be an astronaut since I was 6. And we went to the moon with less technology than we carry around on the phones in our pockets right now, which is insane. And just think what we could do for all the stuff we're talking about if we could make that kind of investment in children and families and family security in our country. I am talking about Minnesota Child Care Association's tax credit proposal. We have had this, I think, for 5 years in various iterations, and we're going to keep going. Thank you to Representative Pryor, who I think is in the back there, who authored it on the House side, and to Senator Paul Anderson for authoring it on the Senate side. And this is a proposal modeled after what Louisiana, South Carolina, Nebraska, and now Colorado just this session have done, which is create a tax incentive for quality, access, and also the early childhood workforce. So our bill was 3 parts. The first part gave a new tax credit to parents, which increased with the quality rating, the parent aware rating of their chosen provider, family child care, Head Start, whatever, child care centers. The heart of the bill was what we call the workforce credit, which was a new credit that would act as an income supplement for child care teachers, whether they be family child care providers or teachers, directors, and child care centers. It had to be a licensed setting, it had to be a parent-aware rated setting, but then the amount of the credit would increase with the education level that that staff member had achieved, and it would be ongoing. It would be every year this credit was available to them as sort of a backdoor wage supplement, because we know wages are so low, artificially suppressed because of low reimbursement rates and a lot of other things in the field. Challenges with this were, number one, it's expensive. I think the Cadillac proposal that we had was close to $100 million. There are a million ways we can make it cheaper. And possibly this year we might just try to push the workforce piece of that instead of the parent and the provider. I forgot to mention the provider credit, which goes to owners or operators of childcare to help increase expansion of providers and retention of them. So we will bring it back this year, maybe try to make it a little cheaper, a little more targeted to the workforce. Obviously, you've already heard and know very well the ugliness of the child care assistance fraud issues really overshadowed everything that had to do with child care this year. And also, there was kind of like the Home Visiting Coalition had this unexpected backlash around data privacy. We, with this bill, had sort of an unexpected backlash aimed at parent aware specifically, and a lot of providers showing up and saying, whoa, if this is tied to parent aware, we're not interested, even though part of the point of it is to increase quality and link to quality. So I think that was a good learning for all of us advocates and state staff and others who work on trying to support parent aware. So that's it.
All right. Next, we're going to ask May to come up, and we're going to give her an opportunity to stand aside of this.
I hate podiums. They are as tall as me. So hi, everyone. My name is May Losloso. I am the senior organizer at Children's Defense Fund, Minnesota. Oh, the clicker needs to move to the next thing. Okay. And I'm also the staffer of the Voices and Choices for Children Coalition. If folks haven't heard about us, we're a group of individuals from all different sectors, and our focus really is to look at improving outcomes for children of color and American Indian children across our state. And we had a really exciting win this year. We passed the Community Solutions Grant Program, and we really want to just make sure that children all across our state are healthy, but particularly children of color and American Indian children often face a lot of different challenges, and we are not just in the metro, we are all over the state. And our state actually has already changed in demographics. So people always talk about, oh, it's going to change. I'm like, look in our counties. It's already different, and we need to really look at the needs of those communities in the ways that they look at their own solutions, because often folks that are closest, to the problem often know the solution, but are furthest away from the resources. So we hope that with this funding that we are getting closer to those resources for communities. And so improving health and wellness right now is really, we're in the middle of the implementation. It's moving fairly quickly. At the Department of Health, the Center for Health Equity particularly is our great partners. And so I'm putting the charge out to folks here and online. Across the state, we are looking for applications for the Community Solutions Advisory Council. This is a 12-member council that would help with the facilitation of this process. So the funding is important to us, but also the process by which the money is given out is key. We want community voice along the way, and really to build up the capacity of community members to be part of these kinds of processes. So check out the Secretary of State website. It is listed in the Boards and Commissions section. Also, I've posted it on Twitter. You're probably going to get it in an email. So please encourage folks to apply to be part of the Advisory Council, and then start spreading the word, especially in Greater Minnesota, communities that are looking to improve outcomes for their children, to apply for this grant program. So that is my update, and ask me more questions later.
Okay, last but not least, Jennifer is going to talk a little bit about the 2020 census.
Thank you, and I'm right there with you, May. So Jennifer Bertram with Children's Defense Fund Minnesota. I work on the Kids Count Project, and I've been a part of the co-creation table with the Minnesota Census Mobilization Partnership, and we worked hard this year to get some funding allocated by the state. Special thanks to my own representative, Jamie Long, and Senator Carlson for working on that this year with us. The initial ask was $2.5 million. For context, California just passed about $150 million that they're allocating to census outreach. This is particularly important this year for Minnesota for a number of reasons, including the fact that we may be at risk of losing one of our congressional seats, depending on how the population count shakes out. There's also been less funding at the federal level to help us with outreach. You might have heard something in the news about a citizenship question that has caused some damage, but democracy won in that instance, and that question will not be on the form. And those forms are being printed as we speak, so that was a major success. And then the other success we had at the legislature was we passed that $1.6 million that's now being allocated to community organizations across the state, including Children's Defense Fund being part of the co-creation table, to conduct some real grassroots movement to conduct outreach for the census and ensure that people understand how important it is for people to respond to those forms. So for everyone in the room, just to make sure you all know, Census Day is April 1, 2020, and make sure you respond to the census. It's very important. Everybody counts.
Thank you. And I'm not sure, Jennifer, if I heard you say, but last time we did the census, there were over 2 million young children, birth through age 4, that did not get counted. And that's why we wanted to make sure we talked about that here. So please keep that in mind as you think about Census Day. And then as we bring up our next speakers, I also want to recognize Cisa Keller is up here. And even though she has not spoken to any of these specific policies, she worked, Think Small has worked on a number of these and have been instrumental in a number of these different policies. We were just trying to keep it succinct, and we were somewhat successful at that. So thank you to Cisa and everybody up here for all your hard work in supporting children and families in Minnesota. So.
If you'll just stay put. Thank you, Laura, and thank all of you. That was awesome. I just want to re-welcome people on the webcast. Apparently, in the middle of Eric's presentation, we became live around the state. So just so you know, we are now on, and welcome on that front. Secondly, we're going to call up our 2 elected representative senator people, but I want to just mention that on your tables, there are cards, 3x5 cards. So if you have some questions, we find that works a little bit better to just jot them down, raise your hand when you have one, and we've got elders and various people around mostly elders around the room who will pick up your cards and bring them up so that during the Q&A we'll have a chance. And we'll also post the email address, which I will do right after we're done. So hang tough. Thank you. At this point, Senator Ralph, do you want to come up and talk about the session? And then we will, there we are. You can freestand or freehand. How does that work? Okay, you can.
Okay, thank you again for having me. All of the above. if we're talking about the session. It was interesting. I guess just a couple of highlights from my standpoint. One of the unique things that happened to me was I was actually put on the Higher Education Conference Committee. I don't sit on the Higher Education Committee, but some decisions were made, and as a result, I did have a chance to impact some of the things that we talked about on that got put in on these scholarships for the early learning, and that was something that was very important and was talked about and discussed at the committee, and so I was pleased to be able to take part in that and to contribute to that. So that was something that I just think I feel really, really good that we were able to get that, and thank the advocates for their work on it and getting that done through the committee process. I don't know how many of you, I'm sure many of you who have been involved in committees, but if we use the committee process, I just want to say this in general, that I found as a freshman senator, this was something I did not understand at all when I came into the legislature, was the importance of the committees and the importance of following those processes. And one of the things that's somewhat frustrating to me, and I'm sure to Representative Pinot and the other legislators here, is this rush at the end where we kind of short circuit the committee process and we go into these kind of bartering sessions rather than really focusing on drafting legislation carefully and following that process. And when we get into these large omnibus bills at the end of the year and we're tearing along to try and meet the deadlines, we do lose something in that process. And I quite frankly do want to say that I am pleased with what we actually ended up this year with. A lot of people will say, well, we didn't spend enough money, but everybody got something, and not everybody got what they wanted. And in the long run, when we finally got done, I think we actually had some pretty good legislation here. Some of the highlights that have really been mentioned here that we did get. Some of the stuff that I worked on in terms of foster care and some of the other childhood initiatives to try and get money, mental health for the schools especially, telemedicine, we're working on that. So these are things that I think that, without trying to get into the weeds too far, that I think really we have a good building block to move forward from. I was disappointed that we didn't pass the kindergarten readiness assessment. That was something that I worked on with the Education Committee, and unfortunately it didn't make it. We'll bring that back. I think that's an important thing that we need to do is to determine if we are doing the right things. Are these programs working? And so I think that measuring results is key importance, and we fail to do that, I believe, at the agency level. Many of the agencies just hand out the money and don't follow up to find out whether the program's working. I also want to talk a little bit about CCAP. As most of you probably know, I was pretty heavily involved in the program integrity provisions that were in the Senate bills. Senate File 4 and Senate File 74 were my bills. They were the ones that were aimed at trying to bring some integrity to the program. And to the child care provider advocates, my intention was to make sure we didn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, forgive the pun. The problem we have is sorting out how do we bring a measure to the program that says, look, if you're doing something wrong, we're going to do something about it, but if you're doing something right, we want to help you out. Because we don't want to build barriers to people coming into this profession. We want to remove some of those, and I think we tried to do that with some of the program reforms we did for the child care providers to work with the fix-it tickets and to work with some of the other, giving them more flexibility, for example, in their use of substitutes, to expand the hours for that. So the real focus, at least from my standpoint, was to try to create an atmosphere where people want to become child care providers and to foster that. And it's a difficult balance when you do have fraud involved. And of course, as was commented earlier, and I fully agree, we got tangled up in a lot of things that we really shouldn't have had to get tangled up on. including some of the discussions about accusations of racism and the approach here. I can assure you that was not the case. The whole object here was to find people who were cheating the government and cheating the people who were really intended to receive this money. And it is a severe problem. I sat through many a legislative session and read many an audit report. There is a problem, and there's a major problem. We don't know how big it is. My point has always been all along, I don't care how big it is. If there's a problem here, let's solve it. Let's not worry about the numbers in terms of how much. Let's figure out why and fix it. So that was a lot of my focus during the year. I will continue to do that, and I will also continue to say that I will not allow an overreaching regulatory scheme to interfere with people entering into the child care area. I really worry about that. I think about it all the time. So that's something I just wanted to maybe clarify a little bit what was going on. I was very pleased to see the carryover and the protection of the unused funds for the early learning scholarships. They were at risk. I think that was something that was just really important, that we made sure that that money stayed in the program. And so we did accomplish that. And I think that was really something that was very important, because a lot of kids are going to get some help because of that. I'm still, and as Representative Pinto knows, I am still committed to early learning scholarships to try and get money for kids so that they get that quality education. There's no question. We've all sat here and listened to the data that shows that the early learning, the earlier we get, the more quality learning that the children get, the better off they do, and the better they do. So that's something we will continue to work on. Hopefully in the coming years we'll get there. Just a couple of other thoughts. Excuse me. One of the things that I was interested in was the idea of allowing for daycare centers to be, or not centers, but for daycare providers to use a common facility. And there's quite a few facilities around the state that are not being used. I can think of empty schools, I can think of buildings that are available that would provide a real excellent opportunity for daycare providers to come together and achieve some cost savings on the matter of scale and on the matter of facility. So this is something we'll continue to pursue. We did provide that. The law now allows for facilities or providers to be within a single facility, even though they're operating under separate licenses. I think that's a good thing. Parent Aware, there's been a lot of issues on Parent Aware. And as a result, I think that it was a good thing that the conversation got started, because it exposed some of the issues that do exist, and especially the child care provider advocates will, I think, agree that Parent Aware, while it in concept is a good idea, it needs a lot of work. I think it can be an excellent tool, but I think it needs work. And so I think as we go forward, that's one of the things we will be working on, is to try and get Parent Aware so that it does exactly what it's supposed to do, that the rating system is modified so that it's really truly showing which providers are the better providers, and giving the ones that have the lower rating the opportunity to increase that rating. So I think that's something we will be looking at. Otherwise, again, thank you, and I'll look forward to, I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions coming forward, and I think at this point I turn it over to Rep. Pinto.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Senator Ralph. So I hope that folks will indulge me a bit here. Part of the reason that I said at the beginning, the reference to this being the third anniversary and starting the fourth year, is what I'm going to present now are some kind of more personal reflections about the session from a perspective as much as an early childhood advocate as a legislator. And I want to make sure to to acknowledge in doing that so many good things coming out of the session. Frankly, when you have, as Laura said, the only divided legislature in the country, to have a 2-year budget to make sure that we start the fiscal year with state employees being employed and providing the services that they do, to secure the provider tax, increase in MFIP, et cetera, is wonderful. And to recognize many of the headwinds that we all were encountering in doing that work. And having said that, I want to, as I say, provide a sort of a particular individual perspective. And it really does draw on the last couple of years, so working together in this space. So let's just keep in mind, right, what the payoff is. This is research, Dr. James Heckman, and of course, hopefully each one of us is doing this work because we believe in some way that what's presented on this slide is true. And this is true as well. And it continues to be true now, just as much as it was before the session. And I think for each one of us, we have our own individual sense as to the ways in which we would want to correct this. And each one of us comes in with our own ideas and senses as how to do that. And I guess part of my thesis here is that part of the reason that we have not been able to adjust this, at least I think it first makes sense for us to hold a mirror up to ourselves. There's many, many factors, but at least part of it is the fact that we do, in fact, each one of us come into this with our own perspective about how to adjust this. And to recognize that no matter what else comes out and the good things that have happened, we're still in this situation where we're putting the least investment in the earliest years, and by a significant margin. And I want to come at that from a perspective especially of early learning and care, which I think brings many of us together. So this chart, of course, combines a lot of different kinds of spending, but I think there's a sense that there's a particular gap when it comes to the question of what happens with children when they are not in their parents' care. We have one of the highest, I think we have the highest workforce participation among moms in the country, and parents as well, and more broadly. And so what happens with children when they're not in their parents' care? We have a number of different possible approaches for that in mind, and they really tie into two separate but related crises, right? We talk a lot about opportunity gaps. We talk about the worst opportunity gaps among members of different racial ethnic groups in the country. I think also a recognition that we are simply underinvesting in our youngest kids and most vulnerable in all kinds of ways with huge impacts. And again, hopefully you're in this room because you already believe this. But then separately, we have a crisis in terms of accessibility, affordability of childcare, which, as we've learned in the forums, is driven ultimately, I would argue, not by regulation, not by various things. It's because the economics of childcare just do not add up. In the same way that the economics of learning would not add up if you expected people to pay for their own 7-year-olds or 12-year-olds, all of them, every single family, to figure out what happens with that, it does not add up. And the economies of scale are that much less when you're talking about an infant or a toddler. You can't have 25 pupils or 25 children per care, and I'll just sort of stop going off. But the point is, you get where I'm coming from. All right, so there's two different things, and I really want to point out that leading into the session, one exciting aspect of this, and by the way, you may notice we're a little bit off on our agenda, and we'll get back onto it. The crisis work group came out with recommendations that tied together both of these, so very exciting heading into this session. We really need to stop, in my view, separating child care from early learning and recognize it's all early learning, development care, it's all tied together, and there are two crucial crises that are underlying both of them. Okay, so we had some response, so I just want to point out, I don't mean to tie these in particular, but we had caucus priority bills in the House and in the Senate. And in the House, we had House File 1, which had a significant proposal for significant increase in funding for scholarships for CCAP, going all the way up to 400% of poverty, birth to age 3, and retaining the voluntary pre-K slots, not adding to them, but retaining them, grants for child care providers, et cetera. And then also other aspects of this as well. And I want to point out from the House DFL, you had a sense broadly trying these different pieces together through a number of bills. Our colleagues in the Senate majority had Senate File 2, which addresses the regulation of child care, and that was a strong priority. Senator Ralph and I met early in the session on that, especially family child care. And I'll note, too, grants for child care providers. And by the way, you may note, if you look, that's listed in both bills. Maybe not surprising that that's something that did end up coming out of the session. And many, many other proposals as well. Of course, the administration really prioritized child care assistance when the budget came out, et cetera. So you've got a lot of energy coming out of this and a lot of focus. The thing is, when you're talking about early learning and care, there are a lot of different questions to answer. So what form of family support? We've had a lot of focus on scholarships versus preschool, but also recognizing child care assistance as well. But you got a question really is, what is our goal? And we've so much come at it from these two separate goals. I want to point out that there's this question of age. Are we coming from school down as we have been, or birth up? There are questions about, I think many of our Senate colleagues, even if they agree, support for scholarships, for example, there's a question of, well, what are we going to do with revenues and what are we going to do with spending? Are we going to be targeted or universal? Are we talking about equality? What exactly does that mean? How are we going to measure it? And really, what difference does it end up making should it make in the funding that we that should happen? So should it be tied to parent aware, et cetera? The point is, all kinds of different questions to answer. And what I want to offer to you is that as long as we each have our own individual answers to those questions, there will not be a significant increase in funding for any approach, for our approach individually or for anybody else's approach. Now, why should that be? There is such energy relating to these crises. There's so much going on. We've had these priorities. But there is so much else that they're competing for legislators' attention. And I kind of want to point this out just a little bit. So these are some of the groups that reached out to legislators on early learning and care issues specifically, and you've heard from a number of these groups as so far. And there's been, I know, a lot more effort going on to combine the efforts of different groups. But I want to point out that these are many more of the groups that come and reach out on these issues. The Minnesota Early Learning Council, which I serve, gubernatorially appointed, had its own set of recommendations that were made, and a number of these other groups. So you've got a lot that is going on in this space that legislators are keeping track of. And I should say, I'm focused on this stuff, and I can't track all of it. It actually took me, I was surprised by a number of things putting this presentation together, in fact. But we are not done, okay? And seriously, the North Hennepin, I don't know if there's anybody from the Northwest Hennepin Early Childhood Network who is here, but this is a group that was reaching out to legislators about their preferred early learning and care priorities, okay? Each group has its own particular perspective on how to do things, and that actually does not necessarily need to be a problem, except that legislators' attention ends up being so much at a premium, right? There's such a focus. And for those who are not focused on this, that can be a real challenge. I want to point out, too, we're not done, because we've got a number of groups that are also having perspective on early learning and care issues, sometimes from some different angles. The Minnesota Child Care Providers Information Network, I hope I'm saying that right, is focused more on regulation and much less on the funding side, but still you're keeping track. We got to keep track of all of this. Minnesota's Future, not as active this particular session, but each of these pieces, I'm going to keep on going for a while, each of these pieces. So, and this is not intended to be saying too much. I don't want you to read too much into this. Hashtags and messaging things don't matter. Oh boy, I'm sorry about the formatting there. It worked on my computer. I don't know. Here's the thing, right? What difference does it make, really? And in fact, I've had some folks who I've talked with about this in advance of this who said, well, the messaging is fine, but really ultimately it's about, legislative decision making. But the two are tied completely together, right? Both the messaging is an indication of solidarity and of work that's been done among advocates beforehand, but also the messaging then sends a message to legislators about where they're going to focus their attention and what's going to happen. And I'm going to I'll do this a little bit in just a bit, comparing to other efforts, but just think about in some of the other coalition efforts that happen, they've got a consistent message that they are pushing as a group. This just ends up being very challenging to my mind. Okay, so a lot of negativity. What do we have in terms of strengths? Well, we have a righteous cause, right? We've got morality on our side, and we have economics on our side. And the way that I put it is, because we know that when you invest in young kids, right, there's a great payoff, of course, in terms of the impact on their lives, and there's a great financial payoff, too. So the way that I put this is, if we're going to be immoral, let's not also be stupid, okay? Right? And so we've got it. We have a righteous cause on our hands. We also have a lot of potential allies. So before, when I pointed out those groups that have early childhood agendas, I was not done, okay? I was not done. So first of all, I just want to point out you've got business allies here, the Crisis Work Group again. These are groups, the Chamber of Commerce, Minnesota Business Partnership, that were calling for significant increased investment in early learning and care, okay? You've got business groups. The American Academy of Pediatrics. And I want to point out, I had some of these slides earlier in the presentation as just different, because it is confusing. There's so many different agendas, but I think we should view this as a strength. We have so many allies who are interested in the welfare of the youngest Minnesotans. We should be able to take advantage of this. We've got the Minnesota Catholic Conference, which had their first 1,000 days agenda. And I have to say, the bills that were being pushed, supported by members of all 4 caucuses, including myself, and prenatal care and home visiting, breastfeeding, prioritizing that. That's maybe not an angle that we might have thought. The Association of Metropolitan School Districts, they want to close opportunity gaps and emphasizing that. Now, again, their preferred method might be different than your preferred method. Well, let's all get over it, right? Let's figure out what we're going to do. And I want to go back to the debates and the policy questions before. We talked about quality, et cetera. But look at that last one. There's a real question of strategy. Do we support families and then figure that providers are gonna be available? This is addressing access affordability. Or do we support providers and therefore families? Or ideally, we do both. There's some really interesting angles on that last piece about supporting providers. We talk about non-traditional allies. Greater Minnesota and rural coalitions were coming to us during the legislative session. The Center for Rural Policy Development is recognizing a quiet crisis in the child care shortage. Coalition for Greater Minnesota Cities, Greater Minnesota Partnership, pushing child care throughout this session very strongly. That's not just it. Impact 2020 is a Northwest Minnesota group. Northland Foundation is a Northeast Minnesota group. We have allies in Greater Minnesota saying this is a crisis. We have 2 crises going on. We have opportunities. And if that wasn't enough, you've got cops and prosecutors who, by the way, came out I didn't even realize this till last night. In mid-March, they came out with this, talking about how this is undermining Minnesota's strengths. Okay, if we can't do it with the cops, the Catholics, the Greater Minnesota people, the business people, come on, man, this is crazy. Okay, thank you. And so the last thing is we have models to follow, okay? Paid family leave, which has been talked about, you don't hear about 20 different paid family leave bills, right? You hear about the paid family leave bill. Now, those of us who are advocates then get mad at the folks who are blocking the bill, in our view, and we can talk about that later. But there's not a bunch of different bills. They have a piece that they're pushing together. The 100% Clean Energy Campaign, again, you can get solar and wind and others together. They're doing that together. Homes for All, again, a current coalition. Going back a ways, marriage equality and recognizing, bringing that table together. And then finally, I want to point out the Legacy Amendment. And again, if you can get Hunters and the Sierra Club and the arts community all together, seems like we should be able to do that too. So the last thing I want to point out is soon after session, there was this headline in a political newsletter a number of us get. Pat Kulikin, I think, wrote it. So here's the question. Is it the next big issue? And that's going to be up to all of us. So let's make it that way. That's all. Thank you so much. And I think we're ready for your questions.
Do we have 2 mics? I think we might. But get your cards written. We're going to do Q&A. Thank you. I think morning hot dish is a good way to describe us. We got some good stuff going on. So thank you. And so we've got, we're going to talk until 10, is it 10 after? By about 15 minutes. We're just going to run it behind a little bit, and we'll squeeze questions as time goes. But are there some right away that people want to hand in? And do we have a second mic? I can't remember. Yes, the gentleman in the back with the webcast has it, so we're good. I want to thank our crew back there. They've been so good to help us on all these. So we'll... And people at the front, if you have questions, we can get you cards too. All right. Oh, here's the questions for the webcast. All right. Thank you. It's a team effort. Do we have, somebody had a card hand. Okay, you got some here. Good. And Sandy's got. Okay, you want to help me look through those? One question is there a way to track the effect of the MFIP increase on families? Who would be?
I guess
Eric?
I can take a shot at it. So track, is there a little more clarification on what you mean by track it on families? Like is the question over time or? Certainly, yeah. I think probably DHS probably has hopefully some of that tracking data. I'm not sure if there's any other type of nonprofit organization that is actually tracking it in terms of over time. But I'd be happy to also look into that and see who is, and if not who, then who should be tracking it.
Okay. We have a question specifically for Senator Ralph. The funding, do you want to come, you can come on up and, so the funding per child per contact hour for voluntary pre-K is about 3 times the per child per hour rate paid for childcare. And what could be done to close this disparity?
Okay, well, I'm going to kind of take a little more broad brush on this. The whole area of reimbursements is one that is, and I'm involved, I'm carrying the bill to try and raise the PCA reimbursement rate for providers. I'm also tied in with some of the work on DWRS in terms of that rate structure. The problem is, and I'll give you a specific example, there was a $1.25 an hour increase in the contract for PCAs. The formula that the Department of Human Services used resulted in a 41-cent increase to the providers. Go figure. So this is the problem we're facing. There is a disconnect, and this is something I'm trying to get into, but there is a disconnect between actual costs and the reimbursement. Now, I hope that kind of addresses the question. I don't have a specific answer. I think it lies at the department level and how they take the money that we do allocate and how the formula works, how they work that formula. It's, I hate to say, kind of a little bit like the school per pupil formula. If anybody can explain that one to me, I'll be glad to sit down with them, reserve a week. That's where the problem is. It's as if I understand the question correctly. And I think this is something we need to focus on, that the agencies need to help with, that we can try and close these gaps between the funding and the facts. And that's one of the things that we're trying to do in the legislature as we go forward on these various reimbursement programs, is to try and come up with direct correlations between what the actual cost to the provider versus what the reimbursement is. And right now there is a disconnect in that. I hope that answers the question. I know it's, but that's kind of where we're at on it. It is very difficult at this point to track that.
Thank you. Do you want to? Denise, we have a question on the pre-K, voluntary pre-K and early learning scholarships, that they primarily serve 4-year-olds. Funding babies first would help prevent the achievement gaps from opening.
I agree 100%.
And
yeah.
so what can be done to prioritize the early care and education for the youngest?
Absolutely, yes. Well, voluntary pre-K, that is not something I was working on, but I'll speak to the scholarships. And this year we were really hopeful that there would be scholarships increased for children from birth to 3. We felt that that was a huge priority, and we're very disappointed when that did not happen. So in my opinion, we have to keep advocating for increased funding for scholarships for infants and toddlers. That's, you know, to me, that's the highest priority. And I'm hopeful that as we go forward, that's going to be something that will be a focus at the legislature. I know that in the House bill, that was the focus for increase to scholarships for children 0 to 3. It's not that there aren't scholarships. There are for various high-risk categories for infants and toddlers and for siblings. So there's quite a few that are going to infants and toddlers, but there's not nearly enough, as we know, and that's the most expensive care. And it really has to be the highest priority, in my opinion.
Okay, thank you. I think it's on the, as they say, on the radar. Regarding the workforce, what is happening on a state level to address the void of parent educators? If the state colleges, universities, and MDE do not address the decrease of parent education with the retirements and few colleges that support this development of parent education, ECFE, Early Childhood Family Ed, and their services will be significantly negatively affected. So I'm not sure. Okay, yes, Krista.
So I'll take a stab at that. Absolutely, we know that there is a shortage of ECFE educators. We know there's a shortage of early childhood special education educators. So when we talk about the workforce, we're talking about all of those.
Yep, okay, so that's part of the birth to 8 workforce. Okay, good.
That was one of the outcomes or one of the issues that was discussed in the higher education in the conference committees. That very topic of early childhood educators was part of the discussion, and that was where some of the stuff that did get in, those scholarships and those programs for, especially for people of color and Native American communities, and that so that's on the radar. It's there. We're looking at it, and I was very pleased that we did have some of those. As I was going through the stuff, trying to get up to speed, so to speak, that was something I was very glad to see. So I think it is something we're working on, and I think just again we've got to focus, get everybody on the same page, and then go forward.
Okay, these are all good questions I'm trying to kind of figure out. What agency or agencies subgroup should be responsible for monitoring the effectiveness of various programs? When funding is approved, should an evaluation be built in all programs? I'm just curious, this might be back to you, Senator Ralph, and also when we have our, Erin Bailey comes later this morning, we might want to put this question to her.
Oh, that's all right. I'm good. You know, okay. Evaluation of programs has been has probably been priority 1 for me since I came into the legislature, and let me explain why. When I first came in, I studied 18 different agencies that were providing services to children. Of those 18 agencies, 9 did not even measure outcomes or results. They had no provisions in their programs to measure them. They didn't even keep track of it. Of the remaining 9, only 2 had objective standards for determining whether their programs were succeeding or not. The rest simply measured whether they added clients. Now, I don't know about you, but that seems counterintuitive. If your programs are working, you should be, as we go down the road, if we're getting upstream enough on these problems, those problems should be becoming less. So one of the things that I have kind of worked for, and I've spoken of this before in the data sharing and some of the results measuring program that we had in a pilot program over in Dakota County. The key is establishing a set of metrics, evidence-based, objective standards that we can measure whether the money we're putting into these programs is actually working. And I have to be very blunt. The Office of Legislative Audit carries out audits of all of these agencies through the 3 years that I've been in the legislature. The main conclusion that I take from these audits is these programs are they're not doing it. The agencies are simply not evaluating their success or failure, which to me is dead wrong. And I think that as advocates here in this room, and people that are if you want to help get things so that we're spending the money the way we should, advocate for accountability. And I am really strong on this, that the agencies need to be able to show how much money they got, how they're spending it, who's getting it, and is it doing any good? And they're not doing that. So and this is something that I just really feel very strongly about, that there's a lot of money floating around out there that could be available that's not being spent properly, and if we focused it, we would be able to do that. So sorry, that's a soapbox with me, unfortunately.
I think I think Laura's going to say something, but I want to note, the challenge is that data issues cost money, right? There were a number of recommendations that came out of the OLA report, and each of them cost money. I worked closely with Representative Lori Pryor in the back in our early childhood committee, and recognize the rest of our colleagues shortly. And we in our committee, when we made our budget proposal, we were faced with some very difficult choices, saying, well, do we spend this money on some of these data measures, but recognizing that, again, each of the preferred proposals that any of us may have in response to those policy questions that I brought up, we are deeply underfunded. It's not we're sort of like almost there when it comes to the early learning scholarships, or we've got almost everything we need for CCAP. We just have to close the gap. But each one of them is deeply, deeply underfunded, deeply, deeply, and it's the fault of nobody involved in the program. And so we really have to, on that piece, so we really have to we're faced with these difficult choices. So I agree, we have to have accountability, we have to push for accountability, but we have to recognize that if we wait to put in accountability and only to take those measures, whatever the proposals are, and only then are we closing the gap. We need to recognize that we're leaving the vast majority of children who could be supported by our favored proposal, whatever it is, we're leaving them by the wayside. We really are at that point having the baby go out with the bathwater. And so we really need to recognize this has to happen at the same time, but we're talking about programs that have been deeply, deeply, deeply underfunded for so long, and that's the challenge that we're in. So I think Laura had something she was going to say too. You got it, Mike.
Okay, is this on? Yeah. So I also just wanted to say yes and let people know that the home visiting programs, the $21 additional million, we're up to $33 million. Evaluation is a very integral part of all of those resources that go out. So that is happening, and that is being tracked with all of those resources. With the integrated care for high-risk pregnancy program, evaluation is built in. So we are doing this regularly with the Community Solutions Fund. It was built in. Everyone who's working on childcare and early learning know that this needs to be built in. And one of both the challenges and the opportunities in working in this prenatal to 3 space is that we don't have any one system that supports families. Families access resources in systems that make most sense to them. And so we also want to be mindful that there's not one or two outcomes that we are going to probably track, but we want to track a whole number of outcomes, because we as people have a whole lot of developmental needs that don't necessarily match up to the way public systems have been formed and designed to serve and work with families. So I just want to keep that in mind as we think about how do we maybe connect those outcomes across systems rather than forcing outcomes onto families that don't make sense.
Okay, yeah. Okay, the older you get, the harder it is to multitask. So I'm going to read you a question here, which I'm teasing myself here, but this, I just want to say one thing about underfunding is that if you think about early Head Start, which is the 0 to 2, 0 to 3, 10% of eligibles basically are served. 90% are not served. So if we are going to close the opportunity gap, we have to really get clear on who we're not serving. So we have a lot of, we want to feel good, and we can feel good about what we're doing, but we do have to be honest about this kind of chronic underfunding. So here's a question for Senator Ralph and Representative Pinto. Accountability and questions of fraud were an obstacle to legislation this past session. How can we ensure this obstacle can be decreased or eliminated? And it's similar to another question we had. So
I feel like those questions actually, interestingly enough, kind of were relatively separate in my experience. I don't know about other folks as well, but it seemed like there were the program integrity concerns about CCAP, and then there was this separate conversation that's been going for a while about data and about other aspects of accountability coming out of the legislative audit report. I guess there's both legislative audit reports, just 2 different reports, and I didn't feel so much like they ended up getting connected that much just in response to that question. And I think what we have to do is, again, it's, coalition work. If you think about the coalitions that I ended with towards the end there, you hit bumps in the road. And we need to, you have to just continue driving and continue pushing. So, I'll point out in terms of program integrity for CCAP, there were a number of provisions that became law. I think that many of them came out of the House DFL caucus, in fact, and working with the administration. And to my mind, we need to keep the message up that the people who are the most hurt when a program is having concerns with integrity are the people the program is intended to serve. And that one of the biggest ways in which a program can lack integrity is when that program is deeply underfunded, which this particular program has been. And to keep that going, all together. The sense of accountability coming out of the other auditor report and what we talked about earlier about data, et cetera, again, to my mind, that's something we need to keep on pushing together and say, all right, well, what are we going to address first when it comes to that? But again, not lose sight. A lot of things happen when you have a group advocacy effort that is well coordinated and is driving together. A lot of good things happen, and there's a lot. And I know I keep on getting back to this theme, but I will just point out that if you were to list the top 50 issues of the legislative session, other than the CCAP program integrity issue, I'm not sure what else in terms of early childhood would hit there. I'm not even sure the child care crisis necessarily would hit in those top 50. As you start to push that, I think that there's a lot that can be addressed, but I continue to think that is the key. But Senator Elf may have a different view.
Well, no, actually, I agree with much of what you say. And I also want to say that much of the program integrity stuff that did finally get in did come from the House language. We had similar tracks, and I think that there was a very good synthesis for what we did do. So again, I applaud for the efforts on both sides to get to where we got. One of the things that I do want to focus on just a moment, and that I think Dave touched on it, and that is that when there's advocacy, when people come in to see me and I get 17 different ideas on the same issue from 17 different organizations, that can be counterproductive. And I think that what Dave is trying to say, and I want to reiterate, is that this group here has the opportunity to coordinate the effort to really come up with good solutions and bring them to us. And I think that's something that I would recommend that there be a focus on that we try and in these focus groups, in the P3 coalition group, and I know we tried to do that a summer ago, was to try and hone in on specific, and I think that was good. That was a good exercise, and I think that's something that I think should be continued, is in narrowing the focus and then coming up with a unified message. There's one other thing I was going to say, and I can't remember what it was. Anyway, I'm sorry, I had a senior moment. I'm sure I'll think of it in a minute.
That's okay. You'll get another chance. This is a question how do you bridge the divide among the early childhood provider community, considering the differences among and within these communities on what is considered high quality? So sort of the struggle. And I'm not sure, Sisa, May, Eric.
I got voluntold to answer this one. So this is obviously something that I'm surprised actually it didn't come up in any of the challenges, but it was something that was underlying, I think, in all of the conversations, was the varying voices is from the community, from the provider community. Mostly, I would say, in the licensed family child care community. For the most part, the center-based community was pretty unified. And so I see it as an area of opportunity and trying to figure out how do we lift up the voices. I think a lot of this actually goes back to what Representative Pinto just talked about, that we are a deeply underfunded, undersupported system. We have decades of no support, and so when you have to fight for the scraps of the scraps of the scraps, you can't find your place in trying to figure out how you come together. And so I really think just identifying that and calling that out is probably the first step. And then really it's about listening. I think we need to go out and talk with the providers and listen to what they're telling us and trying to understand what it is that, that they're trying to articulate. Whether that is about regulation or accountability or funding, ultimately there isn't a single provider that comes into this business that does anything other than wanting to care for children and families. We all come for the same purpose. We just need to kind of find that place. And so I'll just highlight one opportunity that in particular Children's Defense Fund and Think Small recently just actually submitted a grant with some national funders. And then one of the main outcomes is actually going out and raising the voice of folks that aren't typically heard from. And in particular, licensed family child care providers will be one of those voices. And I want to highlight that there is an element of those that may want to be licensed that haven't quite figured out that system as well. So I'll just end there unless anybody else wants to add to that.
Great. I want to add just one piece. So, I mean, we talked about license and providers, but there are a lot of folks, family, friend, and neighbor care that has been, you know, missing from the conversation. I'm speaking kind of, you know, based on my experiences and talking with folks across the state. And, you know, there are lots of folks that are providing care that are also not getting enough support, you know, and so that's just, I'm just throwing that out there, something to think about. And it's hard to get our heads around it because family, friend, and neighbor literally could be anyone. But the truth of the matter is that a lot of children, because, you know, of the underfunding, a lot of families are piecing together what they can. So it's, you know, if you don't have full-time care during the day, you got to figure out who's going to pick up your kids at the bus stop or if you go to work. So these are, you know, not new ideas, but, you know, the underfunding and the support is lacking all across the board. And who else is missing from the conversations? And having, you know, any sort of credential or license doesn't necessarily mean you're not important and what you do is not valuable. So again, the quality, you know, I'm not going to tell my grandma you're not quality because you don't have a degree. Go back to school and pick up that BA. You know what I mean? So right, there's just things that further conversation that needs to happen to really get at the root and the solutions.
Great. Okay, I'm going to turn the mic over to our two. Thank you for that, by the way.
So we actually got a live question from Jerry Rell from St. Cloud, sitting next to me, who asked me a question, and then I said, rather than answering you directly, I'm going to say it to the group. So he said, and with his permission, he said it's okay if I share this. The question was just, you know, so why has the underfunding been coming up in the last few years, the last 5 years, or before that? Yeah, across the board, but sort of why? But in particular, why relatively recently, as opposed to something that's decades old? Because maybe I'm mischaracterizing your question. Okay.
Yeah, my question is that we're underfunded. It's been going on for a long time. This is not something that's just come up recently. This is an underfunding that's existed for many years. And I'm just curious on your take on that. I don't think this is something that's recent. I could be wrong. You've been in there a lot longer than I have, but I think that this has been something that's been a problem for quite some time.
So my understanding, the answer to this, and Jane was helping me with this, is because actually, Jane, maybe you should answer the question since you're gonna tell me anyway.
No, the point I would just want to make is that in 2003, and my colleagues can tell me if I got the number right, but over $70 million was cut. There were massive changes made, and we've never made it back. And we also lowered our reimbursement. I mean, we went from 75th to 25th. And it was kind of this killing, I mean, in some ways, an effort to kill the program, to keep it small. And I think we've never recovered from that cut.
And what I've heard, my understanding is that we had a strengthening economy, things bumped along for a few years because the rates were lower, that was okay. And then we hit the Great Recession, and then folks could make more money still as a provider than they could, and just because the jobs were so scarce. And what I've been hearing then is that since the Great Recession, that's when the squeeze has finally come, because the cuts came in 2003, but it's been this sort of delayed reaction because of what had happened in the ensuing years. That's at least the explanation I've always heard. So there is something new, and of course we've had ever greater participation in the workforce, but also ever greater squeeze, and we have income inequality, which is worse now in 2019 than it was a couple decades ago. So when you add all those things together, families have that much more of a squeeze. So there is a reason that we're experiencing this in the past bunch of years as well.
Yeah. So, I've got three things really quick, and then one is we all come to briefings and are, what shall I say? I'm reading this. I think it's involved in meetings to stay informed. We are hearing a lot of good news about changes and funding increases and what effects are being, and the question then is what if efforts are being made to share the good news with families and communities to give them hope? We need a community-based awareness campaign beyond the cuts and the bad news. So I think there's an element of kind of bringing inspiration into this, into our midst. So I'm going to ask, I've got a question for Jerry Ralph, which is regarding the kindergarten readiness assessment. And could you say more about what is a consistent definition of pre-K success and why is this important? Do you want to stand up?
Okay, I think in answer to that, I don't have a definition, and that may be the problem. What is success, and how do we measure it? In fact, as I recall, there was some statistics and information provided here last fall or it was a while ago when the fellow from Chicago came up with all of the statistics. And as I was watching the graphs, I was wondering, because it looked like the quality education seemed to show up very, very, very dramatically in the first couple of years in first, second, third grade. But then as the whole body of knowledge or body of statistics came together, it seemed like as they were getting towards the later years in high school, the kids that didn't have that quality education were still catching up. And I was kind of puzzled by that. And that's why I say, I'm not sure, is there a definition for success in these programs? And maybe that's one of our problems, is that we don't have a clear definition. And that if we did, it would make it a lot easier for us to measure the outcomes. So I don't have one. I'll be very honest. I'm looking for one. And I'm looking for definitions of measurements of success across the board, as I said before. And I do think I think the agencies are trying. Don't get me wrong. I think this is not a black hole. But I do think it's something we need to focus on, because without that information, we can't tell whether the programs we're using are working or not.
Great. Well, every question leads to more questions, and so I think the opportunity for us to think about dialogue as this goes forward. But I've got a question for you. You can think about this in the break or talk with each other about it. But what are your suggestions for designing and implementing a comprehensive system for early learning? Seems like this is what is needed to make our efforts child-focused and simple for families. So it's a good question. I'm going to leave you with that, and we're going to adjourn for a break. And when we come back, we have some wonderful presentation from Catherine Wright. But I want to have a big shout out to our panel who came to speak and all the work, and to our representatives.
I just want to make sure, in case they have to leave, to just, I recognize my colleague, Representative Lori Pryor. Can you stand if she's still here? Yeah. And please, Representative Lori Pryor. Behind her, Senator Carolyn Lane. Can you please stand? And we've got, to her left is Representative Jamie Long. You can stand up, have folks recognize you. And finally, my vice chair, Representative Carly Katiza-Watoon, is there as well. I'm so glad to have colleagues here. And I should note, too, I'm not sure if she's still here, but the St. Paul School Board member, Mary Vanderwoerd, who's been such a leader in this work, was here. Not sure if she still is. Am I missing any other elected officials here? Oh, Mary Jo McGuire? Excellent, the back there. Excellent, good. Thank you. Hello. Good, thank you. Oh, a pleasure. Yes. Oh, good. Hey, Andrea, thank you. Sorry. So we're going to come back in 20 minutes. Thank you so much, everyone. We'll adjust the schedule from there. Thank you.
I will say just a little bit about myself. I'm a practicing licensed psychologist. I've actually been in the field working with young children and families for 25 years. And I manage the early childhood mental health system at the state and have been working for the past 10 years, and actually a little bit before I got to the state, on it, in really developing a robust evidence-based early childhood mental health system that both has a clinical component to it, and now we're really focusing on prevention. So to start this off, to give you a little bit of an idea about mental health consultation, I want to tell two stories. I first want to tell a child story, and one of the things I will just say is that we've been working on developing a mental health consultation system for the past 3 years in childcare. And the child story I want to tell you about, this is actually one that we got from one of our mental health consultants, is they were called in to a site in Greater Minnesota because a child was getting ready to be kicked out of the program. And the reason for that is that this particular child was running out of the classroom on a regular basis. And for those of you who understand childcare, that's very scary when your children are running out of the classroom or potentially out of the building, and you're having a hard time kind of managing them and staying in place. The mental health consultant was called in, and one of the rules that we have is if there's ever a focus on a particular child, we first get a release from the parent and make sure that a parent is a partner in the conversation. We would never look at individual children without a parent being a part of that conversation. So that actually happened, and the mental health consultant ended up meeting with the parent first and found out from the parent that her particular child, the mother, that her particular child had been dismissed from 2 other programs previous, and so she didn't necessarily want the child care to know that because she was worried about this child being dismissed from that program as well. She also informed the mental health professional that this child had a trauma history, and mom was pretty leery about seeking out services because she hadn't had good experiences herself. So the mental health consultant was holding that information, and what she did with the parent permission is said, can I share some of this with the director in the program so that we can figure out a plan, 1, to keep your child safe, and 2, for you to feel safe enough so we can have a better working relationship so the center can know what's going on and have communication back and forth. The parent agreed, and so what happened as a result of this is that the child care center was able to develop a safety plan for this child so she didn't need to run away anymore. There was a better understanding of the purpose of her behavior, and the teachers were able to better understand how to help and support her so she didn't feel like she had to flee. The mental health consultant as well was able to help that parent get hooked up with appropriate mental health services outside of the center. And I think part of what I really want to say is that across this whole system, the family was held and supported, the child was held and supported, as was the center. And I think that's kind of the beautiful piece about mental health consultation. It's not necessarily poking at the child, it's not necessarily poking at the center, it's holding them all together. So that's my child story. Another story we have is a teacher story. This also came from a consultant. This consultant was called in because a center director was worried they may have to fire one of their teaching staff. And they needed some support thinking about that. What we learned from the provider was that the teacher had been demoted because of licensing changes, and she didn't meet the qualifications to be at the current teacher level that she was at. As a result, she was holding very negative and strong feelings and sad feelings about being demoted, and didn't really know what her role was and was having difficulty communicating with her team members. She felt displaced. So one of the things that the consultant did is actually a lot of work with the center director about how do we understand how this teacher is feeling and what are the other opportunities for her. She has a lot of gifts. She may not meet the requirements because of her education to be a particular level of a teacher, but she still is very much important in this site, and how do we highlight those things? So as a result of this particular consultation, the center director was able to work with the teacher to really highlight her skills and have her be one of the trainers of new teachers coming in about how to deal with more difficult and stressful family situations. And this teacher actually prevented a child from getting expelled by supporting the other staff in how to better work with this particular child. As a result of that, the center director certainly felt better, the teacher felt better, like they were valued and held, and then as a result, again, children got supported well in the system. So that's kind of how we're thinking about mental health consultation and how it's worked so far with some stories. I thought what might be really helpful is to give you a sense, so after saying my stories, I like to tell a good tale. After giving you a sense of kind of what it looks like, I want to give you a little bit of history of where we started and where we've been going. So I will say that some of this work on developing an early childhood mental health system started before I started working at the state. Back in 2003, the state, through, at that point it was called the Children's Mental Health Division, had received a grant from NASHB and the Commonwealth Fund to start really thinking about doing social emotional screening in primary care. What we learned with that particular grant is primary care was not really interested in screening for young children's mental health issues if they didn't have a place to refer children if they found an elevated score. And so at the start then of 2004, my director at the time, Dr. Glennis Edwall, who is one of the elders, was brought in 0 to 3, which is a national organization, to start training our clinicians in the DC 0 to 3, which is a diagnostic process for young children. And actually, I was not working at the state at the time, but I was managing a large grant in Ramsey County from the Knight Foundation, and we used that money from that grant to pay for the first training. So I'm super excited that I got to be a part of it in 2004 before I started working at the state. That training was designed to serve 50 people, and 300 came. 300 clinicians came. So we knew at that point that we were ready to really develop a system. So we had trained all of those clinicians. In 2007, after a number of years of work, the legislature actually created the Early Childhood Mental Health Infrastructure Grants. And those are grants that have been standing since 2007. It's about $1,024,000. And what those grants are used to is they're used to pay for training across the early childhood mental health system to make sure that professionals are doing evidence-based, good clinical work. So to make sure that what we're giving our children is evidence-based and of highest quality. We also use that grant money to pay for uninsured and underinsured children who need clinical services. And I'll say a little bit now about more what we're doing with that money. So that started in 2007. In 2008, we then started contracting with agencies across the state to use that those grant dollars to pay for the uninsured and underinsured and train the workforce. And then in 2009, we partnered with, I think I see Dr. Carlson back there. Do I see Dr. Carlson? Yes. Okay. I told her I was going to call her out. We partnered with her from the University of Minnesota to get 50 of our clinicians who were leaders across the state in our agencies through the Infant Mental Health Certificate Program. Because one of the things we know, and I'll say I've been a practicing mental health professional for many years, most of us do not get good training on development and early childhood mental health in school. It just doesn't happen. Most of our programs are generalist programs, and they tend to focus a lot on adults, not on little ones. And so the certificate program was instrumental in giving our licensed clinicians more education and support on how to assess and treat young children and just understand just regular development overall. At that same time, we started partnering with other universities to bring in evidence-based practices. I do have a really strong belief that we should be providing things that have been known to work. And as opposed to making up stuff that we do. And so we partnered with three other big universities, the University of Oklahoma, the University of California, and more recently the University of Delaware, to bring in some evidence-based interventions that were focused on young children birth to 5. And we've been training our clinicians in those evidence-based interventions ever since. In 2011, we had an opportunity where we actually changed the Medicaid rules for outpatient psychotherapy and assessment to match what the evidence says about assessing and treating young children. So part of our Medicaid rules in 2011 did two big things. It incorporated the use of the DC 0 to 3, which is our diagnostic process for little kiddos. And it also supported our workforce in being able to pay for what we call clinical trainees. Those are clinicians who are either in training, getting their master's or doctorate degrees, or post-degree getting their licensure, so that they could actually start treating our youngest children early on, actually all children and families early on, so that we didn't have to wait till they were licensed. Because part of what we do, if we wait till people are licensed, we have to retrain them when they're licensed. Wouldn't it be so much better to train them while they were in school? In 2015, we reissued our early childhood grants, mostly because grants at the state can last no more than 5 years. And so at that point, we had uninsured and underinsured training for evidence-based practices of our clinicians, and then we added mental health consultation. And I will talk a little bit more about what that means. So starting in 2015, we added mental health consultation as another service that we were going to try to pay for out of that $1 million. And then finally, just this past year, we developed a formal partnership with our child care division, which is also in the Department of Human Services, to really stabilize mental health consultation. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that financially in a very strong partnership with them. So what is mental health consultation? I gave you some stories and some history. Basically, it is a prevention service. It is not about treating children with behaviors or mental health issues. It's really about holding those adults who hold our children in childcare or other early childhood settings. And it's really to increase the capacity of those adults to support the social emotional development of young children. And one of the things we know, and I'll talk more about this, is that actually prevents mental health disorders in young children. So it uses a combination of three things: training, reflective consultation, which I like to operationalize that because it's a word that's used a lot. So it's really about active listening and helping the teacher or whomever is working with that young child have whole different perspectives about what does this possibly mean. You see a behavior, but I wonder where it comes from. I wonder how this is for the child. I wonder how this is for the family to have this hard conversation with you. Like I said in my stories, I wonder for that director what it was like for her staff to get demoted because she didn't quite meet the qualifications of being a teacher. So it's helping to increase the perspective holding of that particular adult. And then there's also some skill building. The way that we've conceptualized it here is that we want to hold, I use that word, meaning support, everybody who is impacting or touching that child in that particular center or that family child care. So it's not just for the teacher. It's also for the director. And actually, we will never provide it just for the teacher. So if it's a center, we think of the director as the head of house. Just like when you do home visiting, you don't just go in and see the child. You actually have to see the parent and go through the parent. And so we see the director as being critical in that they're a part of the process. If there's bus drivers, they're a part of the process. If there are aides and food service people, they're a part of the process. Everybody gets held and supported in that particular setting. There's three kinds of consultation, and we do offer all three. There's program focused, and this is about the center director or family child care provider, and they're supported to really make changes around their practices that benefit all children. It's really seen as a prevention opportunity, and actually this is where we like to do most of our work, kind of seeing it, if you guys are familiar with the pyramid model, we're at the bottom of the pyramid. There's absolutely some classroom-focused consultation where the consultant may work with the teachers to really improve the care that's offered, or even the relationship between those two teachers, or the relationship between the teachers and the children in their classroom. And then there's finally the child-focused interventions, which some states focus all of their energy on this. We don't focus all of our energy on this. We get called for this sometimes, like that child story I told you, which is, I think, important and needed, but we'd rather focus on all the children in the program. And this is when there's a particular child that is struggling. I will say we got this visual from Dr. Carlson and one of her students, Christina Mondi. And I kind of love the way that we're thinking about mental health consultation in our state. So you see the children are at the bottom in the darker green. Right above them are the staff that are supporting them, the child care staff. And above them, we have in our child care system a number of coaches that are going into child care programs. We are in the place right now where mental health consultation, it was started at the child care level, and we're now growing it to all those coaches as well. So not only are child care sites getting supported within our child care system, and I should clarify, the majority of our mental health consultation goes to family child care. As you guys have probably seen articles, we are the leading state in the nation for family child care. And the majority of our consultants are in greater Minnesota. And so a lot of our efforts are in family child care. And then we support all of those. We've been starting to support those coaches that are also supporting that care across the board. We do center-based care, and we absolutely do focus on the Twin Cities. But I just wanted to call out, Minnesota is always special in so many ways, but we are like the leaders in the nation for family child care. So a little bit, this is super long with a lot of narrative. I just wanted to give you a little bit about what we've been working on. So I have been working with a couple of supervisors that are under contract with us, Michelle Fallon, Jessica Nemi, and Sheila Sweeney, to really develop the system. And we've been partnering with our Child Development Division under the Family and Children's Administration, and then also the Head Start Association. For those of you who don't know me, I worked at Head Start for 7 years. And so I have a love for Head Start, and I really love it because it believes that parents are the most important people for their children, which is my firm belief as well. And so they've been instrumental in helping us really think about what is needed with mental health consultation. For the past 3 years, we've been piloting this in childcare across the site, and these are sites that have been involved in the Parent Aware system. And I'll tell you why we focused on Parent Aware. We got a lot of our learning out of actually the state of Louisiana, and they had paired mental health consultation with those programs that were 4-star rated in their quality rating system. We actually love the idea of mental health consultation not being like a clinical service for just children at the top of the pyramid, but really focusing on quality across the board. And so we love the idea of partnering with Parent Aware. We're not focused on 4 stars, we start at the beginning. So even those that are starting to build quality, like they're interested in getting their stars, but they don't have their stars yet, they qualify for mental health consultation all the way up through all the star ratings. One of the things that we ensured is that all of our consultants were in the Parent Aware system, so the consulting that they provided and the training they provided actually counted for those staff to get the, higher up the career lattice. So we wanted it to count for credit, is kind of how I describe it. We want everything to count for credit. And as I said earlier, the majority of our consultation right now, I want to say about 2/3, is provided to family child care across the state. And then I have my little citation there of the article that was sent to me about how we are #1 in the nation for family child care, especially in rural communities. This one is also, I'm sorry, it's so dense, and I was going to say my slides are absolutely, you can have them, so you don't have to write this down. But I thought research is helpful. I'm a psychologist, and so research matters to me. So like, why are we doing what we're doing, and what does the national research tell us about why we would do mental health consultation? What we know about it is, one, it reduces staff turnover and burnout. And so we have issues right now with childcare staff leaving the field. We know they don't get paid well, and we need them to stay there because we know for young children, the more disruptions of primary caregivers they have, and I will put childcare providers as an important caregiver, the more hurtful it is for children's mental health. So and we want to keep people in the field. So there's like a number of reasons why we would want to do it. Mental health consultation prevents burnout and staff leaving the field. It also decreases mental health symptoms. There's actually what we call a randomized clinical control trial where they looked at children getting mental health consultation and children not, and they used a standardized mental health assessment that's pretty well known and used, and they found out that children that got mental health consultation had reduced mental health symptoms than the children who didn't. And I want to say why I think this is important is that services were never directly touching the children that was going through their teachers. So you can change mental health symptoms in children by holding those adults who are holding our children, not by intervening directly on the children. Does that make sense? And so that's what that study showed us. It reduces the educational disparities of children of color. There's been a really robust study done out of the state of Arizona where they were looking, they've done a longitudinal study, and they actually have a $5 million in their budget just for evaluation. It's kind of exciting for them. And what they found is that when they were focusing specifically, they asked teachers who were worried about a particular child that they thought they might need to discharge or that child had some troubling behavior. They had the teacher fill out an assessment prior to consultation and post-consultation, and what they found is that the children of color were really low on this particular developmental assessment when they started, and then by the time that the consultation ended, they surpassed their white peers. And again, I want to emphasize that the children were never directly intervened with. The teachers were got the intervention. And so I want to say that what a lovely opportunity to change some of the dynamics we have around racial disparities. And as was said earlier, we have some of the largest racial disparities in the nation. And it's not necessarily about the children, it's about the whole system and how are we holding the whole system. It also has been proven to show a reduction of expulsion and suspension in childcare. And I don't know if you all remember the study that Walter Gilliam did a gazillion years ago, where he found that children were kicked out of childcare four times at a higher rate than any other age range, including all the way through high school. They are expelled at higher rates than any other age range. Mental health consultation reduces that. And that's the symptom is the expulsion, the cure is the consultation. Again, supporting the teachers in that system. And then the other things we just know is that it also increases just staff feeling competent in addressing things like trauma in their sites, in holding families that are having a lot of their own struggles, and really in their own mental health, holding those families with their own mental health conditions. And that's kind of goes back to my first story that I told you about with the child that was running out of the classroom. It increases the staff's ability to address those more effectively. A number of years ago, maybe 2 years ago, Representative Pinto said that I should have some data around how much things cost, and so I did what he told me to do. And so this is a very non-scientific study. I will say that as a psychologist, but I did do a little query. We pay for what is called mental health day treatment for young kids, and that's when children have a mental health diagnosis and they're treated in a small group up to like 15 to 20 hours a week. And it's very expensive. And so I asked all of our early childhood mental health providers, tell me, out of your number of children you serve, how many got kicked out of childcare prior to coming to you? And they told me that there were 68 that were expelled from childcare prior to coming to them. I calculated the costs of what that was for that child in that preschool day treatment, and it's about $5 million a year for those 68 children. So just kind of to give you a sense, and I will just preface this by saying I also did preschool day treatment a number of years ago at Washburn, and 100% of my children had been kicked out of other settings prior to coming to me. It's not an unfamiliar picture. When we were paying attention to like how many children in our pilot were we actually serving over the course of 1 year and how much did it cost us, because we're again holding the entire child care system, that center or that family child care, we're impacting more children than a one child. So in our first year of our pilot, we were serving between 900 and 1,200 children, and it cost us $1 million. So I will say preventing mental health issues by really supporting the system was much more cost effective. Thank you for that recommendation. And I actually have shared this across the nation because other places want to know, like, how are you figuring out the cost benefit? It's not very scientific, but it was a good way for us to kind of hold what did that mean for us. A couple things about our consultants. They are all licensed mental health professionals. They are under contract with me. I work for the Behavioral Health Division at the state, and we have 60 of them. I will say they do this very part-time because I also need those 60 folks to do clinical work within our bigger system as well. So they're doing it very part-time. And as an early childhood mental health professional, having the opportunity to work with systems and work with families in a mix is a much better way of keeping our people in the field as well. All of our consultants have expertise and experience and skills in early childhood development, early childhood mental health, relationship building, and motivational interviewing. And they are all required to be trained in the DC 0 to 5, which is our diagnostic process. The DC 0 to 3 was the start, and then 0 to 3 updated the manual for diagnosing young kids. It's a lovely way of holding what different mental health perspectives look like developmentally across birth through 5. The other things that we do is all consultants are content area experts in the relationship-based professional development part as mental health consultants, meaning that this is their criteria for being a part of Parent Aware. So they have their own special designation, and they are also trainers in the Parent Aware training system. So all trainings that they provide to child cares count for those child cares to get credit, and actually the consultation counts for them as well. So part of what we've tried to do is embed ourselves in the child care system so that it would count for people and feel more valuable. And then by 2020, all of our consultants will hold infant mental health endorsement at level 3 or 4. And the other reason we wanted to do that is we wanted that consultation to also count for those child care workers to get endorsed. And mental health endorsement is a specific thing that we have in our state that's held by the Minnesota Association for Children's Mental Health. And so it's a way of really increasing the competency across the systems of our workforce and making sure that what people are getting is counting for many different reasons. I hope that makes sense. It's a lot of lingo, I'm sorry. People often ask me, how are they trained? How are our consultants trained? They get 100 hours of training on what consultation is. On adult learning techniques, there's specific requirements within the Parent Aware system that for you to actually qualify in the Parent Aware system as a trainer, you have to get these specific trainings, so we provide those. And then how to implement the trainings. The other things is that we have been extremely intentional about thinking about implicit bias and racism in this state, mostly because, one, we should all be thinking about that, but two, because Minnesota struggles with a lot of disparities. And so we need to really think about how do we impact that. One of the things that we know is that you can't give something you don't get. And so we really focus with our consultants on let's look at ourselves. We are all a part of this system. How are we thinking about prejudice? How do we know where we come from? What is our perspective? How can you hold somebody else's perspective if you don't know your own? And so we've been doing some very intentional trainings on reducing implicit bias with our consultants. In understanding privilege and also addressing bias. The other things that we also provide within our system is all consultants receive 2 hours of small group supervision on, per month on those topics and now we have 4 contracted supervisors. I said 3, but we have 4 now. We added Judy Woods. All of these supervisors then also get supervision from a national expert. Her name is Khadijah Johnston. So again, you can't give what you don't get. So all consultants get supported and all by supervisors, and the supervisors get supported by a national expert, which I kind of love that again. We're trying to be very thoughtful about holding the whole system and not doing it part way so we don't get the outcomes we want, I think is what I'll say about that. People ask me, where are your people? They're all throughout the state. They're under contract through my division under me, and we have 26 agencies, and two of those are tribal nations that are doing mental health consultation with us. And then one of the questions that kept coming up is, how do we know it works? And I am a strong believer that we shouldn't do something that we don't know works. We have national research, but we always want to know, is what we're doing actually changing the system? And so we are doing 2 things. Dr. Carlson is actually replicating the Walter Gilliam study to find out who's getting kicked out of childcare and what supports do childcares need so that we can be much more thoughtful with them. And we'll hopefully have that data later this year. And then now that we have a more formal partnership with our child care division, we are building a pretty robust evaluation system where we are going to focus on 4 specific measures. One of them is Walter Gilliam's questionnaire about expulsion, and it has a high correlation. When teachers are thinking about a particular child, there's a high correlation to that child actually getting kicked out of childcare. So we're doing that pre and post. We are also using the Maslach burnout scale for teachers. If you guys are not familiar with it, you can check it out. All of these are things that you can check out by yourself. And what I like about the Maslach burnout scale is actually there's different versions of it. There's versions of it for human services workers. There's versions of it for healthcare. There's versions of it for students. So if we were to ever expand mental health consultation, we could compare apples to apples as opposed to apples to oranges. And we're going to do this pre and post, before and after consultation. We're going to be using the Harvard implicit bias scale to really look at implicit bias pre and post, and I'll tell you what that looks like. And again, you can do it yourself. Actually, I did it myself, and then I made my family do it, and then I made my bosses do it at the state. So feel free. But they actually came out with a new version. They pair black children with white children, and there's positive and negative words, and you type really fast to see how you associate them. It's free. You can go ahead and do that yourself. The one that most of us have taken has adult faces, but I'm super excited that they have child faces because that's what we're talking about with bias is children. And then Walter Gilliam just recently came out with this particular evaluation called the Climate of Healthy Interactions for Learning and Development. Early childhood, we love a good acronym. It's called the CHILD. And we're getting trained by Yale this summer on it, and it looks at teacher-teacher relationships, teacher-child relationships. We asked to put in teacher-parent relationships as well, so we're going to be piloting that with them, and we'll do that pre and post, and actually the consultant fills that out, and it's a standardized, validated tool. So we have 4 big tools that we're going to use pre-consultation and post-consultation. And I'm hoping... and I should say, and we're in the process of contracting with an evaluator to help us understand what the data means. So it's one thing to collect data, it's another thing to analyze it. And I'm hoping that we'll start having reports next fiscal year to understand how we're impacting mental health consultation, or how mental health consultation is impacting the systems we're working with. So our next steps, as I said, we're in the process of expanding consultation to our quality coaches, which are in the Parent Aware system. And we've been thinking, though we haven't done anything, so please don't think that we've started this. We've been thinking about how to expand it to all childcare coaches so everybody can feel held and supported. We've been thinking about child welfare. As you know, a number of our children in the child welfare system, especially with the opioid epidemic, are under the age of 5. And those cases are really, really stressful for staff. And how do we hold those child welfare staff so that they are doing good work with our families when their jobs are really so stressful? We've been thinking, not doing anything yet, but thinking about Part C and Part B 619 in the education system. Again, a lot of them are holding families that have a lot of distress, and we want to make sure that they're being supported and held in their work. And then we've been talking with our public health partners. They currently get reflective supervision at the local level, and we've been talking with them about how do we think about this on a bigger scale in a more systemic way. Again, we've not done any of this yet, but these are the things that we've been processing. And one of the reasons we wanted to think about the MASLAC, because it can go across so many systems. Other states have been thinking about providing mental health consultation actually in primary care, in NICUs, in those places. So who knows? We might see where it leads us. And then the other thing that we're going to be doing, not just thinking about, is really building an advisory committee to guide our work. It's been a small group of us working on this, and I think now that have a little bit more stable funding and we'll start to get better outcome data about what we're trying to do, we need really somebody or a group to help us steer this ship. And so certainly we're focusing on things like equity and burnout, and part of what we're also really thinking about is how to get families who might have experienced expulsion out of childcare or other systems to be a part of that advisory committee. So that's where we're headed. I'm hoping that advisory committee starts to get formed in the next 2 or 3 months. Gosh, and that's it. So I have time for questions. I guess I didn't need a whole hour. And I will say I am a state employee, so I may not be able to answer all of your questions. They might have to get vetted by my administration. I'm just saying that out loud. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's thank Catherine here. First of all, Okay, there's a hand at the back. So, Kath, go ahead. Carly, do you want to send her a representative? I'm sorry. CISA is on the way. Okay. I want to say something about what you've done too.
It is, okay, there we go. Thank you. I appreciate the presentation, all that information. It was really helpful. We actually had a proposal in the House this year to ban preschool suspension and expulsions. And I wasn't sure if that was something that you were aware of, it was something that you had been a part of the conversation, and kind of maybe how we can, whether or not we move forward with a ban, which did not go through in the education bill this year. Is this something that could be implemented in process, and how we might be able to link these two things? Because if the kids aren't getting help, whether they're staying in school and not being expelled or suspended, it's truly just being in the building isn't going to impact their mental health, the classroom atmosphere, the teachers' burnout, those types of things. So I just was really curious how you think we might be able to connect these two issues.
So I can kind of answer this question. I would say nationwide, many states are putting forward legislation around suspension and expulsions in childcare. The one thing to think about is you can't just have that as a rule without a way to better support. And so what most states are doing are putting money in for mental health consultation, because actually that's the one thing that has been proven to work to reduce that. As I was saying earlier, though, what makes the most sense kind of systemically is the prevention aspect of mental health consultation. So if sites can get it before they start to feel like they're in a crisis mode, that's so much better. So I think the policy around suspension and expulsion has to go hand in hand with the solution, which would be mental health consultation, according to national research, not just what I hope and dream for. So yes.
Thank you so much.
Yep.
I appreciate that.
Okay, go ahead, and then I've got a question from the audience.
Mine's kind of a question, but it's actually a suggestion. Can the state expand mental health consultation by helping current CTSS providers offer these services as an extension of the work that skills workers are doing in their interventions, especially because they already have the relationship with the children and the families?
So what I will say is CTS, so again, well, here's a couple things I'll say just from the literature and my own experience as a mental health professional. This kind of work is work that mental health professionals, they're not ready right when they graduate from school to do it. They need a lot of experience. So it's different than an intervention with the family. It's holding a whole bunch of other people and using kind of therapeutic interventions. So I would say for skills workers, I'm not sure that they, what the research is showing us is that they're actually, if they're not licensed mental health professionals, there's no research to show that that's actually effective. So I want to say that. The other thing though, where I think skills workers are very effective is that when we do have children that have mental health concerns, oftentimes they might go into settings to better support that child there. And that's absolutely a good use of the skills-based services for young children. The majority, I will say, of the evidence, actually all of the evidence shows that the best interventions for young children are family-based, not individual-based. And so we would want to be holding parents as well as a part of that process. But skills work is very effective, like in a childcare setting or a school setting when the child is having a hard time regulating. That's a good use. Correct. Correct, but that's where the skills-based would be most effective, I think.
Okay, I'm gonna just inject here, and then we'll get back to you. Building on the question about preschool expulsions, are you working with school-based programs including preschool or only childcare?
Right now, we're working with childcare.
Okay. All right. The Home Visiting Coalition has worked with Michelle Fallon, one of your team leaders, to provide consultation with home visitors in Minnesota. Could you share some of the positive outcomes beyond the teacher-child relationship?
So I don't know the literature of what's been happening or the outcomes of what's been happening with home visitors. I see Don is there though. I don't, because that's not a system that we've been systemically doing mental health consultation with. There is national literature on mental health consultation, I believe, with home visitors. I'm just not super smart about it.
I've got, can you speak to the opportunity to offer this training or resources to family, friend, and neighbor providers?
That's always such a good question because how do we find them? and how are they organized, or are they organized? Some of the things that I actually have available in the contracts that I have with my mental health agencies is they can do community outreach meetings with their communities. They all are located in community. They're not like all located in the Twin Cities. And so some sites have thought about how do we bring in families or community members across different places and do a training. And those are some of the ways that we could think about it. Outside of that, I don't think we've had a whole lot of ideas, and I'd be curious about what you think about ideas about how to organize it in a way with folks who might not be as organized. I don't know. I'm open to ideas.
Okay. Well, one question leads to another, as they say. So, and there'll be more dialogue. So here's another one. How is the agency, that means DHS, expanding and developing collaboration with community-based organizations? One such organization providing trauma-informed childcare and co-located with mental health clinicians in schools, Head Start and public schools, has had its budget for mental health services cut in half for 2016 to 2019. This organization is a trusted member of the community, providing Ojibwe and Dakota language immersion childcare, 4-star rated with phenomenal outcomes. So this is, I don't know if you don't know about it, I think I would just invite whoever put in the question to be sure we talk. But do you have something to add?
I don't know that specific program, but certainly that program would be eligible for mental health consultation. So I guess that's all. I don't know.
Okay. I know the focus here is early childhood, but is there mental health consultation available for the public schools and elementary level?
I shouldn't say. Okay, I will. So that would be my dream. Oh my gosh, wouldn't that be so lovely to have mental health consultation from birth to graduation? That's all I could say about that.
That's right. Well, I think this is, I don't think we've got one more person in the audience, so let's hear from you, Steve.
I come from a healthcare background, and I'm wondering how the mental health consultation program connects with pediatricians' offices, family medicine offices, and whether or not they might not be one of the places where you could find out about the family health care or the family care providers. Because I think maybe the problems occasionally show up in the pediatrician's office or the physician's office.
That's a complicated question, and I'm going to see if I can try to maybe try to answer it. So we haven't provided mental health consultation to primary care providers. I'll just say that. There's some states that have thought about that. We haven't. But one of the opportunities I think we have with primary care is that the majority of our consultants actually work in community mental health agencies that are doing clinical work with young children and families. And one of the things we require when you do an assessment with a young child is that you absolutely have to loop back with the primary care provider, physician, or nurse practice, because they hold, with parent permission, they hold information that we don't hold, and we need to make sure we're in a feedback loop. Often clinically, I have found that children have been deaf or hard of hearing. They look autistic, but they're not. They're actually deaf or hard of hearing, and I've learned that from primary care. I've learned that the child has had extreme lead exposure that I would never have known, so that might explain some of what we're seeing. Or the child has asthma, and they're on albuterol, which has side effects that look like hyperactivity. So connecting back with primary care on a clinical level, absolutely we require that when people are doing a good assessment. Systemically, have we thought about how we can do mental health consultation in that realm? No. And part of it is, I'll just be really honest, we have like a tiny pot of money that we're doing this with, and we're starting with childcare. Any expansion to other systems requires more funding. So I just wanted to say that out loud, though I think we'd always be open to having conversations, and I appreciate the earlier points about how are we all teaming together so that there aren't 20,000 proposals coming to the legislature. Like, are they connected, and how do they work together to better support the whole system? I think that's really helpful.
I had actually just wanted to make an observation related to that, and going back to the question asked by Representative Katish-Watun by Carly about the proposal for preschool expulsions and to prohibit that. So we had a lot of discussion about whether that proposal should pass, and the thought that we really need to provide support to students and support to children, to 4-year-olds in preschool program. I'm not aware of this being discussed at that time, and it didn't sound like, Catherine, that was something that was connected. You've been connected to child care work. So this makes kind of the broader point about 4-year-olds who happen to be in child care settings are connected to this and receiving this. 4-year-olds who are in district-based preschool settings, I guess, are not. And we had the discussion at the legislature about the 4-year-olds in preschool settings and what should happen, expulsion, et cetera, and yet completely missed this whole discussion that's happening about 4-year-olds in child care and a method to prevent expulsions. So just making the point about connecting the dots and all of us doing it, including me. I was just really reflecting on that there's this whole thing going on, and at the same time as that whole debate about expulsion of preschoolers and no connection being made between them. So we all just need to keep our eyes open. So thanks. And I think we're...
Wow. Well, I want to thank Catherine and also use this as an example of infrastructure development applying a developmental lens. So in other words, you start with sort of this basic importance of attachment and relationship, and how do you help support that? And so I know it'll embarrass her, but I'd like Betty Carlson to stand up in the back, because this work really has been a collaboration I've watched over the years, and we've been extremely fortunate. So, okay, so onward. We are on track, and we might even, you never know, get done early, but no pressure. So, so I want to just at this moment invite up. Is Erin Bailey here? There you are. I'm sorry. The light gets to me. Thank you. Erin Bailey is the director of the Children's Cabinet. Welcome.
Thanks.
Yeah. And I'll click your...
Thank you. I had these visions of hiding in the back and sort of jumping out when she called for me. But thank you so much, everyone, for inviting me to come and provide an update on the Children's Cabinet. I am delighted to be here among so many friends and excited about the work that we heard about this morning, and looking forward to working together with everyone moving forward. We'll see if I can. So you threw me off, Jane, with the different backdrop format of the slides. So looks great. Yeah, great. So a brief kind of update on where we are since last we got together. The Children's Cabinet has been working hard to redesign, reevaluate how does the governor use this cross-agency body in Minnesota to drive forward an agenda for children. We have spent extensive time with the National Governors Association, had several convenings and technical assistance. I've been on the phone with executive directors from children's cabinets in other states over and over again, really learning from existing models about how do we do this work differently. I couldn't have asked for a better segue than Catherine and Chair Pinto talking about dot connecting and the importance of unified agendas, working together, really starting first with our state agencies. So you might hear some of this and have from Amanda and the preschool development grant work, but we've identified 44 reports since 2007 that have been written around children and families and how we, making concrete recommendations for how the state needs to do its work differently in different areas. And so we have spent time allowing that wisdom and expertise from families to sink in and drive how we think about this work moving forward. We have spent extensive time with commissioners and leadership across agencies. So I have met with 22 commissioners to talk about how do we center our work on children and families, what do you need, how do we get concrete about what that looks like, how do we serve as a tool for you to move forward your agenda for children and families and work together. And then meeting with all of you. So I should have counted just for fun the number of hours kind of sitting down in one-on-one conversations, forums that we've attended to listen and lift up. What are we hearing from you all and from families and from children about really where the state needs to be accountable for how it does its work differently and what sort of outcomes we want to see for children. And then lastly, I would say really digging into the data. Where do we have data? Where do we not have data? How are we linking data or not linking data? How could we look at that differently? How could we slice that for kids and families involved in systems? And how can we use that as a tool for accountability in our systems and for lifting up and advocating for what needs to be different for children and families in Minnesota? So a children's cabinet is truly about what most states have done, and how the governor wants to use the body here is how do we align people, data, money, and policy around children. And I would say that in a large governance sense. So what you are going to see in our children's cabinet is broader agency participation. We're going to follow the statute, which includes about 9 agencies, plus invite many more to the table. Our executive order, which I'll talk about in a second, you'll see essentially every agency being invited and asked to be at the table, with the exception of Veterans Affairs, who doesn't have specific programs that touch children and families. So we've got a large group of folks that we're working to be putting together action items about how we work together. And what that means in terms of strategies for us of aligning those systems is convening leaders, aligning existing cross-agency work, linking data. Second, how do we promote accountability and action? So where do we get really concrete in a couple areas for building a cross-agency muscle of working together? And how do we set some public goals that we want to be accountable to, and how we're going to do that work differently? And then lastly, how do we use this body to build collective policy agendas, and perhaps even collective budget agendas moving. Many states have done that. So for those of you that might be familiar with children's cabinets in other states, New Mexico, for instance, has every year releases a very robust children's budget, really detailed programs across the administration. So potentially that is something that the cabinet would look to. And so part of our role in beginning to convene this cabinet is to lift up examples and models of how they can work together and what that will look like. And then how do we build strategies for public-private collaboration? I would say I have heard loud and clear from many of you in this room and leaders in this field, and I use that term kind of in the big sense in terms of in areas of healthcare and early education and housing, and many folks that are thinking of economic security around children and families, a desire to be really create space for us to be working together and align our work. What would a Minnesota plan for children look like? And so I think that is a vision that I'm hopeful down the road that we can work on collectively together, and that beginning to launch the Children's Cabinet will create space to do that work. So the governor has said his vision is to make Minnesota the best state to raise children, the best state for all children to grow up in the nation. And that's for each and every child, regardless of race and regardless of zip code. And so living out that vision, what does that look like for us, and what does that look like for the Children's Cabinet? So he has said that he truly wants a government centered on children. So I have spent, and the team has spent time with these agencies, spent time with commissioners to say, as you're building your action plans, as you're building your strategic vision for this agency, we want its effect on children to be a lens that you're taking and a priority that you're thinking about in all of your work. For some of them, I would just, it might be a little bit of a stretch, but we're working on them. And how do we think about these issues as a whole family approach? We have really heard loud and clear, I have, from families and from the data that we have, that the success of children is so dependent on the success of their parents, their grandparents, their guardians, the homes and communities in which they're living in. And I think Amanda can speak to this in terms of what we're hearing from the community needs assessment in the preschool development grant, that economic stability of families is so closely tied. And so how do we approach these issues from a whole family approach and bring the agencies along in that work? And then, as I said, to get really kind of concrete in a few areas, utilizing results-based accountability from day one. How do we ensure a healthy start for children? What would access to affordable quality early education and childcare look like? Mental health and well-being being a key priority for us. And then lastly, housing and stability. And those are sort of the initial early priorities that you're going to see. I would say we think of these in a very cross-agency focused manner. The governor is incredibly passionate about children's mental health for a lot of reasons, one of which because he was a teacher for most of his career, and the number one retention issue for teachers is not being able to meet the mental health needs of their students. So when we think about each of these issues in the intersection, we're holding that very core to how we're doing and approaching our work. So what comes next? I just wanted to share kind of a few highlights of what I think of as early successes. So every policy that's coming across the governor's desk that agencies are lifting up as a policy to bring forward in his package next year will be evaluated for its impact on children. So we worked through that process to infiltrate existing processes of how the government develops its policy agendas, how the governor approves those, to ensure that there's a children and families lens on all of that work. Worked on broad agency leadership engagement. So, like I said, spending lots of times with commissioners together and individually, and beginning to lay the groundwork for what that convening and pulling them together looks like. And beginning to think about the cabinet as a central governance structure. So this is kind of a perfect segue to introducing Amanda here in a second, but we've got lots of cross-agency work happening across the administration. And how do we use these as tools that are helping us achieve a central strategy and work collectively so that we are moving farther, faster? And then, as I said, really, the governor has said, I expect children to be a center of the work, and I expect cross-agency action. And so we feel really proud of that, the framework that's been laid in terms of how we're going to approach the next 3.5 years of this administration. So we're going to issue an executive order that is going to relaunch the cabinet. I have August 7th on here, but as you know, in my life, things change often. So what I'm going to do is send out an update to Jane that can go out to this group around the day that the executive order will be issued. It may be that day. It's possible that there might be slight shifting in that. The governor and lieutenant governor are very excited about that and both want to be there. And we want that event to be an event that stakeholders are invited, you all are invited to be there while he issues the executive order. And so I'm going to get that date and process out to you. What will happen for sure on August 7th is the first convening of commissioners. So coming together to begin to exercise this muscle and get the work started with the commissioners all together in the room. I have no time left, but if Jane will give me 1 minute, I'll take a question or two if there are any. No. I'll be right here.
Very exciting. Amanda Varley from Department of Ed. We welcome you. And the Preschool Development Grant. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. So when Jane invited me to speak, I said, well, we don't quite have results yet. So this is more of a process update on the Preschool Development Grant. So I was here last time we all convened and gave an overview of the grant. So I'm just going to spend a minute giving an overview and then talk about kind of where we are in the process with the grant. So how I like to start talking about the Preschool Development Grant is that the name can be a bit confusing because it's actually a partnership between the Departments of Health, Education, Human Services, and the Children's Cabinet, and it's prenatal through age 5. So the overall goal of the grant is to coordinate and align our early childhood systems. So that's why, Erin kind of teed me up well on this as one tool to be supporting the work of the Children's Cabinet, and really nice timing with that. The goals specifically laid out within the Preschool Development Grant from the feds is maximizing parental choice, improving transitions, and also improving the overall quality of early childhood programs. We built on the vision from the early childhood systems reform work, which is when we're focusing on children who are facing racial, geographic, and economic inequities, all children and families thrive. So you heard that vision shared earlier this morning as well. And so it is a planning grant, so it is a 1-year planning grant. 45 states and territories were awarded the grant. It started December 31st, 2018, and goes through December 30th, 2019. We received $4.7 million. On September 2nd, this is the latest information we have. I'll put a caveat to that in a second. On September 2nd, the grant application will open for renewal grants, and that will be a 3-year grant opportunity, and it will close November 1st. 2 weeks ago, the feds released a forecast that said that they were going to have a total of 20 awards out of those 45. 10 would be for states who are continuing to work on their needs assessment and strategic plan process, and 10 would be for states who have completed their strategic plan and needs assessment process. The big caveat on this is that on Wednesday we had a conversation with our federal program officer to say to expect a change in direction next week. So we will see what that means. I am as curious as you all now are about it. So a little cliffhanger there. But what's posted on the federal grant right now, it is kind of the same parameters for the renewal grant, where it's focusing on coordinating systems, easing navigation for families, and with highlighting transitions, access to quality, and those things. So you can also be clicking and refreshing that federal grants page next week. The product that's coming out of this grant is a strategic plan. And there are a number of activities that are happening as part of the grant that are going to support that strategic plan. So one of them is our community-based needs assessment. So I'll talk a little bit more about the community-based needs assessment, but then I want to provide you a bit of an update on the other activities that are happening. So just as a follow-up to Catherine's work, there is work that's happening with the Child Care Division on a path for practitioners to become endorsed through the Michigan Infant Mental Health Association, so just as an alignment there. We've also working on gathering information from stakeholders about transitions, stakeholders being parents, providers, on transitions from early childhood to kindergarten. There's work with multilingual learners, and so parent interviews are about to start to talk about parents' priorities and decision-making processes as they think about language development for their children, how they're accessing programs, all of that. There's work right now we have contractors working on embedding trauma-informed care, multilingual learners, and cultural responsibility within our knowledge and competency framework, and there's additional work that's happening as part of the workforce as well. And there is work on effective communication strategies with parents. And interviews and focus groups are taking place with that right now. So there are a number of different activities that are going towards the strategic plan. This is highlighting our process for the community-based needs assessment. So we've worked with 10 different community grantees throughout the state who have done an incredible job reaching out to their communities to gather input and really focusing on, aligning with that vision of parent voice, people of color, greater Minnesota, and low income. And we have gathered that information, started to make sense of it, lift up themes with our Planning and Advisory Committee, and then in 2 weeks, we'll have those themes sorted out, and they'll be going back out to the communities to say, did we hear you right? Does this reflect your values? And then help us prioritize these themes. Come back, make sense of it again, and then work on that strategic plan. So they did such a tremendous job that we are now swimming in data. So I know you all have probably experienced this where you have so much information that you're analyzing. So these are preliminary numbers, but there was at least 84 meetings in 34 communities, all 11 tribal nations, over 100 participants. So far, it's looking like it was mostly parents, but we also understand that they're wearing multiple hats. So a lot of childcare providers were also parents. State did 12 listening sessions with different task forces and councils. I recognize many of your faces from a lot of those sessions. A couple of you were in multiple councils, so I thank you. And like I said, that next round is going to take place between July 29th and August 22nd. We heard loud and clear from our community partners that it's summer in Minnesota. Getting people to show up at meetings is, it's a little hit or miss. So we're also going to have some sort of online virtual option to provide feedback as well. And like Erin mentioned, there are 44 reports and existing needs assessments that state staff is working to review to also inform that strategic plan. So look for our webpage for more information on the next round of engagement. And then a project I wanted to highlight that has been mentioned adjacently a couple of times today is responding to those Office of Legislative Auditor, a couple of the recommendations within there specifically about data use. So there is work within the grant exploring data sharing and a common identifier. And the objective of the group is really to optimize data sharing so that early childhood services are better coordinated and burdens are reduced for children, families, and I will also add frontline workers. And so right now in that process, we're doing stakeholder interviews, and then we'll be with counties, nonprofits, schools, Head Starts. And then there'll be recommendations for legal review and also review on what technical capabilities would be needed to make this happen. And I will just highlight that data privacy is absolutely central to this work, and we're approaching it with a lot of integrity to that goal. Finally, I just want to include a save the date. So one of the projects out of the grant is a training about implicit bias and how implicit bias impacts, it's a barrier to reaching all children. And so there'll be 2 different sessions, one on November 18th, which is focused for attendees who are making policy, program, and funding decisions that impact children and families. And then November 19th through 20th for those who are working directly with providers, children, and families. So more information coming there. And then here is the web page, and I'll just leave it there, and my email address and our website. So thank you.
Are there final questions? Denise. Let's grab a microphone for our cards we won't worry.
Right.
Denise, go ahead.
I was just curious if there was a relationship between your community planning process and the Community Solutions Fund planning process, which I know is working in communities to look at community-based ideas coming out of those communities. Is there a connection?
With the process of the Community Solutions Fund.
Is that specifically the community solutions that passed this last legislative? So I had a note to follow up on where that is right now. Just the timing of it is very recent. So there will be. I will say we're being extremely intentional about who we're partnering with, and that's been one of the gifts of being the Children's Cabinet being a part of this as well. Department of Health is one of our core partners in this work, so yes.
Okay. Point well taken. Oh, here.
Okay. I just wanted to build off the comment that was, or the question that was posed by the gentleman earlier about the involvement of healthcare in these conversations, and I'm going to keep banging that drum because when we look at where we really interact the most with our children and families, the healthcare setting is one of the places we are capturing close to 100% of the families. If we knocked out childcare settings, we'd probably only hit about 50% of families, and particularly when we're looking at the families that are at most risk, if we are only focusing on those areas, we're going to be missing many of those. And so, particularly in this, the last program where it talks about specifically in the goals or the mission of child born healthy, wondering what, if any, engagement's been done with healthcare systems and how they can engage in this work, particularly around, I guess, the specific topic would be the data sharing and those systems, but other opportunities to better engage our healthcare systems.
right now we are at the spot of stakeholder interviews and engagement in a lot of different ways. And so with this task forces that we've worked with on for the preschool development grant that the state specifically did listening sessions with healthcare providers sit on several of those task forces. So we had input there. With stakeholder engagement around the data sharing, we've been interviewing some people about models that have happened in healthcare, but we have not yet, I can add it. If you have suggestions on who to talk to, I'm happy to do that. And yeah.
We've engaged the Children's Cabinet with a lot of providers as we're sort of moving forward, but I think we should take it head on and do it together. You just nominated yourself, so.
All right. That's a great outcome. Okay. I'm looking at the clock, and I'm thinking this is a moment we should head for wrap-up.
Actually, I'm just going to be very brief. I want to thank everybody for coming. I'm excited about what I'm hearing here. I think we've got something to continue to build on, and just all of the input. I mean, this was a real fire hose today. So, and I think that's good. So thank you, as I say, and looking forward to seeing you in October.
And I want to thank, if you'll indulge me for just a minute, would all the elders for infants please stand? And if we can please thank them as a co-host and the work that they've done. Anybody in that group? There's several, and there's more as well, I know. I also want to thank my constituent, Dr. Chris Subramanian, who is not only a pediatrician, he's also a microphone delivery person as well. And we're so grateful to have his help and all the volunteers that we have. And then in particular, we've had a person who's been coordinating this work. So this is all volunteer done. A lot of my constituents, then working with the School of Social Work, which we're so grateful to. And then one of my constituents who's been involved in this work from the beginning, has been coordinating things, is Jessica Griffith. And she will be, so Jessica, here she is, if we can applaud her. Jessica is starting law school in the fall, and we'll be moving on from doing this work. And we actually have a couple of items, again, if you'll indulge. Jane, anything that we want to say about this at all? Let me hear.
Well, we were going to give you a complimentary set of time cards, but because you make us look good. But we really thank you, Jessica. You've held us so well, and these are little tools of the trade for law school. So we just wish you the best in your new chapter. So we're going to miss you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. So.
Well, we're so grateful to Jessica and everybody. There were frustrations coming out of the sessions. There were great successes coming out of this legislative session. We have a new administration we're really excited about, and we just need to keep on working together. And so October 21st, I think, is the next one, correct? And then I think we have a date in January as well. I can't remember that date, but we'll send it out. And please, let's continue to figure out how we can collaborate more effectively for the youngest Minnesotans. Thank you, thank you, thank you, everybody. Good stuff. Thanks. And thanks those who joined us on the webcast. Thank you so much.